Good evening. So hopefully this is coming through. This is the first broadcast of 2018, and I have a new microphone here, so hopefully people are hearing this. I'll just presume that they are. At any rate, good evening. So I'm basically doing this live stream, follow up on a variety of videos that were made in the last month or so that were directly addressed to me from the liberal slash skeptic slash, I don't know what you call them. I call them liberal technocrats generally, but they include people like Noel Plum, King Crocoduck, and I believe I have one other. Is it by Gary? Is it by Gary Edwards? I'll have to see this. At any rate, I downloaded these videos, and instead of doing sort of laborious response videos, I thought the best use of my time for my audience is to indeed do a response video, but to do it live. That way, I think I could answer questions from the audience. I could give them the time they require, and I would save myself sort of the editing time that goes into cutting up a video and doing a response video in the classic format. I think in the future, I'm going to be saving the classic response video format for sort of longer form videos that explore original ideas of my own. I think that the form where you go after other people's ideas with a cut up, unless you have a really succinct point to make, I think they can oftentimes be more work than really they warrant in terms of the actual response. Let me see this here. By the way, I'm just going to wait here for a little while people start coming in. It looks like, if people have questions, I'll try to answer them as best I can. Oh, yes, indeed. The first one is going to be Gary Edwards. So, again, just for people who are just arriving, because I know people are filling up in the chats, this is a general response to 3 criticisms I've had from Gary Edwards, then from King Crocoduck, and then from Noel Plum. Last time I did this, I was intending to go after the Noel Plum video and the Dark Matter 2525 video. Indeed, I didn't have time. I was getting really frustrated, so I decided to just kick it down the road, and so now it's 2018, and the can has finally landed down the road. So I'm going to wait for a few minutes and just ask people if they have any questions in the chat. Not seeing very much here. Again, I think some people kind of got put off by my New Year's stream. This New Year's 2018, I broadcast a 6-hour playthrough called Vox Mortuus, which was radio for the dead. Basically, it was just a rehash of 1930s radio. I collect a bunch of old audio, and I thought it would be nice to sort of shut up for once and let tradition itself speak, give a broad section of what it might have been like listening to the radio in the 1930s, and let that play out as it will. So Son of Tiamat says, I made a sort of response to you over a small disagreement, more of a nitpick than anything else. Would you consider debating Richard Spencer on Andy Worski's show? So Son of Tiamat, yeah, I definitely respond to that on a future Distributist Answers video. As you see here, I've abbreviated it to Dist-Ans, which stands for the Distributist Answers. I intend to do this to take care of general response videos. Maybe I didn't actually download the video this time. Maybe I'll take a look at it next time I do one of these things. Would you consider debating Richard Spencer? Absolutely. I'd love to debate Richard Spencer. That would be pretty awesome. Looks like some people enjoyed that. Yeah, I think it is really interesting. It gives you sort of an insight to what radio might have been like. And it was. I mean, radio was really different 80 years ago, and you look at some of the lineups and some of the fare they played on the radio in the 30s, and you wonder, like, did people have higher IQs then? Because people were consuming very intellectual stuff. Classical music was a big seller. All right. I'm gonna let this go on for a little bit. Talk perhaps about some content I have coming up. Again, yeah, I'm going to try to make more positive content. I'm thinking of shifting a little bit more towards the cultural criticism angle. Again, I have that long promised and not yet recorded stream or a series on nerd culture, and I think that will sort of be a kickoff to discuss more cultural things. I also have a long promised series on my bookshelf, going through the books that I own and providing some recommendations. A lot of people have wanted me to do that, and I think it would also be a nice follow-up when I'm kind of shifting to more of a cultural criticism angle for the channel. Of course, I'll still do politics, still do philosophy, I'll still do criticism of liberalism and criticism of the alt-right. I can't imagine that cultural criticism is going to steer away from those topics. It will certainly involve that. But I thought that, in the vein, I did a series of videos before I did the whole atheist thing. And the series of videos was why we as conservatives or traditionalists need to be more positive and provide a positive voice in the modern world. And I realized that there just isn't a lot of positive examples out there for people. And I think focusing on elements of culture might be a way to address that. And I got into this huge atheist slugfest, and I think it just kind of went nowhere. I think it was fun. Some insight came out of it, but altogether, I think maybe focusing on positive culture might be better in the future. Invite the boys from the Discourse VCP. Well, I would like to invite people from the Discord. The problem is that the way I have this set up, it's basically just coming straight from my mic into OBS. This isn't a Google Hangout, so I can't even invite guests on. Maybe I'll fix it up later so that we can do these response video series in terms of with other guests. But for the most part, I feel that for my hangouts, for sort of the flying in and the general hangouts where I have 8 people on, I like to sit back and let other people discuss. Here, this series, it's really just for my own voice to be heard. If I get into a debate with Fritz or Ben over some point, I'm really not answering the critic who's up on the screen. I'm having a stream with Ben McLean or Fritz, So this is a better mechanism just to focus down on the subject I have right in front of me. How tall are you and what is your IQ? I have no idea what my IQ is. I'm 6 feet tall. Can you contact Andy Worski on Twitter? He's looking for someone. I will contact Andy Worski. Thank you for reminding me. What do you think about Joshua Boyle? I have no idea what that said. I have no idea who he is. Sorry. Are you considering streaming with Millennial Woes? I am. I haven't, to tell you the truth, I need to start kind of figuring out how to talk to the alt-right. Every time I do it, I'm like, I feel like I'm going to get trapped into a conversation about race, and it's not really my thing. Everyone knows I focus. I don't really care about it. I'm more of a cultural person. Okay, someone brought this up. Thanks for having Reactionary Expat. I will definitely have Reactionary Expat for a one-on-one interview sometime. I think he and I see things very similarly. I think in some ways, him and I have much more aligned views than Millennial Woes and I would. I mean, Millennial Woes, maybe this is just the nature of his channel and how it became swept up in the sort of Spencerian alt-right, but I like Millennial Woes when it was really more about tradition and reaction and the decline of British society. I kind of lost the thread when he got really, really deep on this whole racial angle thing. Probably people are going to be like, oh, that's the only thing he ever talks about. I felt that the older Millennial Woes had a much more diverse focus, and it seems like he might be going back to that. Okay, would you consider talking to Ryan Falk? I had Ryan Falk on my channel doing a debate on the alt-right about 8 months ago. So I have nothing against Ryan Falk. Right, really, at this point, it's a matter of scheduling. Actually, given that we're almost 15 minutes into the stream time, I think that I will try to answer as many questions as I can. But for the time being, I'm going to start the broadcast. So last time, this is just a warning for people in the chat. Last time I did this, the audio on the VLC side was way too loud. I'm hoping that people are going to help me correct for this. That I hope people are going to tell me if it's too loud. I tried to balance it, and I was not successful. One last question. Yes, I'm going to try to do a stream with V2. I know I said I'd get around to that. That would be, I hope maybe tomorrow we could do it. That would be good. I think he's doing a Sargon stream tonight, so we'll see what happens. Anyway, I'm going to start. I haven't watched, just to give you a build up here. I have 3. I started this when there was much few people on the live stream. So I have 3 criticisms, 3 response videos that people have made to me in the last month or so. And they're all from a liberal, technocratic, skeptic, and I don't like using that word, perspective, sort of a Sargon perspective. And I'm just going to go down the middle and go boom, 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 answer them all at once. This is why I am calling this stream the liberal Gatling gun, right? Because I want to take them all out with a minimal amount of time. I haven't really watched these before. A lot of people have described to me what they featured prominently. For instance, I've been told that one of them features a discussion of the mouse utopia, which I find interesting because the mouse utopia is a very common example brought up in reactionary circles. We'll see how it turns out. I assume everyone can hear me fine on the microphone, so I'm just going to go right into it. I assume people will start seriously complaining or something in the event that the microphone gets screwed up. This is a new mic, by the way, so I have no idea how it's coming across. Anyway, so the first one is Gary Edwards defending liberal technocracy. So again, I'm going them in for considerations involving time. I'm going to start with the shortest one and go to the longest one. That way I can be assured that I'll get through at least one or two. I feel like if I start with the Noel Plum one, the probability that I'm going to get really tired and not do the next ones is going to be largely increased. And I know this this is the first in last out type deal, but it really has more to do with the amount of time than it does to do with how I'm prioritizing these videos. Anyway, let's get right to it. Hold on, let me check my microphone one more time. I apologize, guys. A little technical question. All right. Yeah, let's get right to it. So, defending liberal technocracy. Let's see if this plays.
Hello, tubes or podbods, because this is probably going to be more of a podcasty thing. So this episode is going to be a defense.
Are people seeing this? Hold on, I might be having problems here. Okay, I'm not seeing this on the screen, on the preview screen. Oh wait, there we go. Okay, must be a little bit of a delay. I assume everyone can see this, so I'm just going to keep on going. I'll reset it though.
Hello, tubes or podbods, because this is probably going to be more of a podcasty thing. So this episode is going to be a defense of liberalism, or it's going to be a defense of liberalism against a criticism that the Distributist made in his recent discussion with King Crocoduck.
Okay, the Distributivist. Okay, I've had people call me the Distributionist before. I know there's one thing I could regret about designing my channel. I'd probably pick a better name. I never really thought that this would be a YouTube thing that I was doing. So I picked a name that had my initials and that represented G.K. Chesterton, and I needed a D word, and Distributist was a really good choice. So I've heard lots of mispronunciations, but I really like Distributivist. He also misspells it, too. Maybe he recorded this and then rewrote it so that the text would match the pronunciation. That's kind of cute.
Going to be a defense against the charge of liberal technocracy, against the claim that a dialectic of enlightenment, as in enlightenment liberalism or liberal democracy, is fundamentally flawed in some sense. Now, I'm of a very different, shall we say, ethnicity to the Distributist. The character of what I was born into is radically distinct from that which I think the Distributist and his like exhibit. For example, I'm a product of the Scottish Enlightenment, the English Reformation and its settlement in English liberalism. It depends how far back you want to go. I'm also a product, I'd imagine, of the reforms of Solon and Pericles. So,
okay, I should have sort of laid out my critique before I started this video. So for people who might not be familiar with my previous fare, as I've called myself a traditionalist, and in my interactions with people like Sargon and people, well, to a certain extent, people like Via Monroe or King Crocoduck and Gary Edwards, although I haven't had direct interactions with this particular YouTuber, I've been highly critical of what I consider to be a very extreme or rarefied version of liberalism. And this is, the sort of Lockean liberalism that comes out of Thomas Paine or something, but in an extreme form. So this is sort of the idea that we can take the human creature, we can divorce him from his traditions, we can treat him as homo economicus and put him in a society that respects his rights just as an individual, and that this liberal society is going to be the best for carrying forward Western culture and humanity into the future. Now, I've listed off a number of problems with this perspective. Now, it's not that I think that liberalism, and this is, I think, a mistake that I suspect that I might have to be answering very directly when I do these videos. It's not that I think liberalism is bad. I'm actually quite fond of it, right? But I consider liberalism to be a flower that grows in the garden of Western civilization. It has to be cultivated. It itself is an achievement. I don't expect that a flower like liberalism grows wild. It doesn't. It manifestly doesn't, just as an anthropological question. We understand that liberalism does not grow naturally in human societies. We have never seen this occur in certainly not in hunter and gatherer societies, but even in advanced technological civilizations outside of Christendom, this kind of idea of individual expression being a primary value in society, it's very, very rare. So, my real direction in this is to criticize people like Sargon, because and I don't know if this is, this might be a straw man, it might not be, but if it's not a straw man, it's a mistake that they lapse into unconsciously. It's like what King Crocoduck himself said about the blank slate theory, right? Like, no progressive actually says they believe in the blank slate theory. So in some sense, it is a straw man. But it seems that every one of their mistakes seemingly descends from an implicit belief of blank slate theory. And that seems to be the case with this notion of liberalism being that which can sustain a society, that which our society is based on. Because I don't think you can base a society on liberalism. I think that a number of key moralistic features of a society require something other than liberalism to support them. And I could go on for like an hour about this, and I've certainly made other videos that have discussed this. Probably people are tired of hearing me talk about it, and I wouldn't be surprised additionally if I'm not going to repeat my arguments again. But I agree. I think he's characterized my position very well by saying that I think something is fundamentally wrong with liberalism. If by fundamentally wrong, I mean it's not sufficient. It's insufficient in it itself. Not that it's not good, but that liberalism is insufficient. So let's continue.
In effect, I'm a Protestant atheist reformist, and he's a Catholic theist conservative.
Guilty as charged.
So what do I make of his criticism? Well, it sets off on the same foot as leftist critics in pointing to nominal discontinuity. The idea that laws, as they're applied in the physical sciences, are radically and irreducibly distinct from those that are applied in the social or political sciences. Physical laws are, of course, entirely universal, applying at all times and all places. And
is my voice indeed getting robotic? I don't know what to do about that, guys. I'm sorry. I can try to decrease... What could I do about that? I guess I'll just have to talk through it. I'm sorry. This is the problem with these new mics. You don't exactly know how the configuration is set up. perhaps I'll just have to keep on going. If it's a big problem, I hope people will continually ping me. I guess I'll just try to reset up the stream, perhaps with a different microphone, if it's a huge problem. But I just like to go over this nominal discontinuity thing. I think he's onto something here. I think a criticism is that, the laws in society, the normative laws, moral laws, they're qualitatively different than laws of physics. I think that in some sense, Christians, we in our metaphysics and in our epistemology, we rely on postulating a fundamental similarity between moral laws and natural laws. But the fact that we notice a similarity in moral and natural laws does not mean that we're confusing them to be the same thing. And I think that the problem is much more difficult in progressivism, because I think that in progressivism, and probably less so in sort of the liberalism I suspect is coming out of Gary Edwards or King Crocoduck, it seems that progressivism does have a hard time. It oftentimes does lapse into sort of naturalistic fallacies, thinking that there is some similarity between normative laws and natural ones beyond just a metaphysical postulation that requires us to do things like natural law. I'm going to continue.
Offer a high degree of certainty over a very simplified set of concrete particulars, whereas socio-political laws, or the laws of the socio-political sciences, tend to be far more localized in their scope and cover large, complex and highly variable sets of phenomena, up to and including phenomena that are said to be dependent upon agent interpretation. It's this difference that the distributist uses to claim that social science is difficult, low confidence and irreplicable.
I think this is a good statement of one of my positions. So I've sort of used this in several of my videos called the cult of confidence, and here I've kind of used this to to me, this is sort of the source of a fundamental error, right? Which is to sort of take these sociological results we have and imagine that because we use the scientific method on them, they sort of share in the confidence of said method. And I think this has been the source of a lot of dishonesty in our society. We'll see where he's going with this.
He's not alone in that. It's not uncommon amongst many social scientists. Christy Winters does it, for example. Now, one's views on this issue depends on what one takes laws of nature to be, and that's hardly an under-debated topic in philosophy of science. The two poles in this interminable debate, of course, are between those who believe that laws merely express regularities in things like observation sentences on the one hand, and on the other hand, people who think laws denote formal necessitations that are buried deep within the nature of nature itself. But as I said, this debate has been going on for quite a while.
So I'm going to comment here. It's kind of odd, right? Because when you think about this, the Christian kind of falls in the center of this, right? Are laws repetitions? Are they just noticing a statistical correlation, right? So we don't know that there can't be magnetic monopoles. Or, sorry, maybe that's a bad example. People don't know that magnetic monopoles are forbidden in physics, but let's use a simpler example. We don't know that heavier things have gravity. All we've done is observed a lot of heavy things and have seen that they all seem to have gravity. And from this, we develop the laws of gravitation, right? This correlation. And the other one is that there actually is some kind of metaphysical law that requires, logically, that things gravitate towards larger objects. And this sort of goes back and forth, but I've oftentimes noticed that the Christian or the classical theist sort of falls in the middle. On one hand, we believe that there are, in fact, laws. The universe is comprehensible, that it's been imbued with rationality at its core. And because of that, you could very well say that nature has laws. At the same time, they are not indeed absolute laws. They're laws of ordinary operation, for which we could postulate anomalous, or as a Christian would say, miraculous operation, where the normal laws of nature are suspended and another force, a divine will, comes into the earth. And in that case, we have something, the correlation is suddenly interrupted. And, our inductive logic about how nature is going to continue in the same pattern is disrupted critically. Now, I noticed that from the naturalistic point of view, we have either advanced skeptics who think that all inductive logic cannot be used. Just because we've seen the sun come up every day doesn't mean it's going to come up tomorrow. And the people who think that the regularity of nature forbids miracles from ever being considered. And I think that, from my point of view, both of those are exaggerations from what we actually are seeing and what we need to assume to do science. Hopefully I'm not getting too technical here. He's dropping a lot of words, so I have to drop a lot of words too.
And certain intermediaries have emerged, and a particularly new generation of ideas have started to emerge I find interesting, and which I think offer up an opportunity of bridging the gap between the social and the natural, so that the pessimism voiced by the Distributist and others, it might not be quite as warranted as they think it is. Physics envy should really be a thing of the past by now.
Whoa. That's a pretty strong claim. I mean, I don't know. I hope he goes into this, but he essentially postulated that this problem with confidence that we've experienced in social sciences is there's been methodological avenues that have really rectified this. I guess I'm less aware of these methods. I haven't seen them. I hope if this is true, he'll give me a little bit of insight into where I can learn more about this. This is very interesting.
Said forthcoming videos on this because it's an interesting subject. Okay, so the next step in the distributivist criticism, which I call the argument circumstantial contingency, it's sort of partially in step with the leftist radical criticism of liberal technocracy, but then takes a radical detour given the different passions that are at play between a reformist and a conservative. I mean, we recognise from the left that they distrust what they see as the circumstantial embedded nature of the scientific enterprise, but because they're angry at injustice, they see it as a continuation of that injustice, and it's just white male power or some such. Whereas if you're a conservative and you're actually more afraid of decay, what you're going to react to is more the contingency or the faddishness of the scientific enterprise. So because the distributivist's passions lie more in the latter camp, this is his point of departure from the typical leftist critical theorists. He doesn't like the idea that the circumstantial interests that pull science hither and thither entail a certain contingency. Naturalism can only provide contingent facts, hypothetical desire-based imperatives, when what society needs, in his view, in order to avoid collapse and calamity is, if not necessary truths, at least synthetic a priori truths and categorical imperatives.
So I guess this is, well, if I can parse this, and this is really dense, so I apologize to the chat. If anyone wants me to stop and answer a question, I am reading the chat. Just do the @Distributist thing, and I'll try to catch it. Otherwise, I'm going to assume that people are hearing me, that everything is going fine. But I'll try to parse what I think Gary Edwards is saying here. So he's saying, essentially, okay, well, there's two ways to be skeptical of science. One is to sort of question the biases of the person doing the science, as progressives certainly do. This has been a problem in the science wars for a really long time. Indeed, I mentioned this in the King Crocoduck stream. There was this very famous Sokal hoax, where a physicist, Alan Sokal, saw that a variety of social sciences were essentially launching criticism of science itself, saying, oh wait, it's all white males doing the science, therefore there's this huge bias. And sort of to get revenge on him, he published a variety, I think there were several ridiculous papers that were just made up postmodern critical theory gibberish, and he got them published in leading sociological journals. So this was sort of the revenge on, I think, what he's associating with Christy Winters, the sort of science skepticism from the SJW lens, or from the progressive lens. And I think it's not so unfair for him to compare my skepticism to that of the left. Mine really resolved more around the fact that scientific fads erupt. And this means that not only are there large errors, right, in people doing results in science and in sociology, the errors aren't independent. So if people here are statisticians, and you know casino logic, right? The idea is that, okay, well, at any given time someone could beat the house for a large amount, right? But on average the house is going to win because all of the rolls are independent. But if, for instance, someone winning made it more likely for other people to win, the house could stand to lose a lot of money. And the same thing applies in social science. It's not just that these scientists have low confidence, it's the fact that their mistakes are going to be correlated. So we can have a massive misperception essentially build into a consensus. And that's what's really dangerous. Now, Gary Edwards says that, well, I think that we really need to base society on things that are more trusted, things that are, and again, I think he gives me credit here, I like what he's doing, things that are considered a priori to be true. And I think this is certainly the case. But I don't think it's going to come out of science. I think that this essentially has to be something that comes naturally, organically. And that's sort of where my belief in tradition comes in, at least on this debate.
And therefore, in his view, his criticism is naturalism risks societal collapse. Now, the appeal the distributivist makes to the circumstantial, contingent nature of scientific truth, given the all-too-human means by which it's arrived at, is somewhat akin to those of the anti-science SJW, wherein rational dialectic, with its appeal to evidence or cogent argumentation, is revealed by a supposedly superior class of sage as just so much cant with a C, as a thin crust of arbitrary bad faith, entirely contingent upon self or class interest. The response, in both cases, being to inquire as to by what means, other than appeal to empirical evidence and cogent argumentation, the sage's epistemology is supposedly superior. After all, the pathos.
Okay, so I'll stick out my neck here. So I have a question. He's referring to Derrida's deconstruction of signification. Yeah, I think that's true. I think he definitely is. I think he's referring to that among other things. But if he's asking the question, like, why do I rely on tradition over empiricism, as flawed as it is? I think this is sort of the Enlightenment perspective, right? We believe that the traditions that were designed were essentially done randomly. They were assigned for no reason whatsoever. They were pulled out of a hat. They had no antecedent. They had no conscious attempt behind them in the past. And also, not only was there no conscious attempt behind them in the past, not only was there no previous generations trying to apply rationality to a world that they experienced in the same way we did, there also is no evolutionary forcing factor. And I guess I'm sort of answering the question as I'm setting up Edwards' argument, right? I think I would answer that in absence of a controlled scientific experiment or a rationalistic argument for or against doing something, I think that the presumption has to be placed on tradition. Tradition is the organically grown answer. It's knowledge delivered to us through generations and generations of people who have attempted the same problems that we're currently experienced, and they have learned things. And it's not even, and that's one side, right? The thing is, it's not even that simple, right? It's not just that previous generations consciously attempted to answer these questions and came to a conclusion, and then they handed this information down to us through tradition. Unconsciously, through the effect of survival, in sort of a Darwinian, and I hate using that word, in sort of a culturally Darwinian sense, the poor answers have been weeded out, and what we are left with essentially are, in tradition really are the tradition that we have in front of us through our ancestors are essentially the answers of which all of our surviving and reproducing ancestors or previous humans have come up with as the proper way to live and survive as well. It's essentially a survival handbook of society written by the societies and by the individuals who themselves survived. Now, again, and people might criticize me, I can imagine that a Catholic or somebody is listening to this stream and they're going, "Oh, well, this is Darwinism. This is you're discounting all sorts of reasonable theological metaphysics that we developed." For sure I am. Right now I'm answering this as a sociologist, as a philosopher in a secular sense. Now I think that there's yet more metaphysical and philosophical reasons to prefer tradition from a Christian point of view, from an Aristotelian point of view, from a Platonic point of view, and we could discuss those, but no, I'm talking essentially to Edwards here. I would say that we have two reasons to organically believe that tradition contains information that can be effectively used to address questions, even that controlled scientific experiments cannot properly answer. So I'm assuming that was a question, and that's my very long drawn-out answer.
So what passions happen to motivate one, be they optimistic or pessimistic, shouldn't be confused with the logos of truth. And this isn't to dismiss conservatism. If there are things that are valuable and vulnerable, conservatism is the correct response. But we need to be able to judge whether that is the case or not. And that's where rational discourse and capacity for critical reflection that is not prohibited by unduly conservative worldviews, well, that's where that becomes a little bit more perhaps useful than conservatives sometimes realise.
So I'm going to stop you here. Now, I think this is a very respectful attempt to address my objections. I really appreciate it. I think oftentimes there's a danger that the critique is misunderstood. I don't think that the argument is whether we should have rational discourse about tradition. I don't imagine traditions being this kind of radioactive thing, and we can never look at and critique them. I think that's just anti-rational and Luddite in its inception, and I think that, it's not a straw man because it's done in good faith, but it's certainly not my position. My position is it really is the Chestertonian one. And that is, if you approach a tradition, you approach it with the burden of proof. You approach it having to demonstrate to a high standard of evidence that this tradition can be unseated or dislodged slightly, and that it will not largely hurt society. And I'm sure I'm kind of holding off on the specific examples because I'm pretty sure that in the next conversation I get into, I'm going to go into those. But it really, the question isn't about whether there should be rational discourse, but where the presumption lies and what assumptions and the rules for governing that rational discourse should be.
Liberalism is not to dismiss conservatism, but to cultivate those virtues of critical scrutiny, wherein we must decide what is prudent or chaste, or indeed how free our free will is, and how much of it we need in order for our, say, morality to work.
I mean, this is the perfect example, right? I mean, how much free will do you need for morality to work? I mean, he's postulating this question like he's sitting in front of a knob, right? I mean, he's not. This is sort of my objection, and it's not meant to disrespect these thinkers, because I recognize this mistake in myself. Morality can only work if there is something called free will. If there's any amount of free will, morality works. Is free will absolute was never a question that any conservative or any Christian or any Aristotelian or any Platonist ever took seriously. Everyone since the beginning of civilization knew that there were some constraints on free will, obviously, right? Okay, the king says, you are going to marry my daughter or I'm going to cut your head off. Oh, your free will is constrained. Boom. Like, we understand that. We understand that environment constrains some things about free will. That's not the issue. The question is, if free will not only it exists less than we thought it did, but doesn't exist at all, are moral statements even sensical? There hasn't been a really sensical. There hasn't been a good answer to this question, and the real quandary faced by liberal naturalists. I don't know if Edwards is one or is not. If you're a naturalist and a determinist, then free will is gone. Like, and not gone in a little bit, like, oh, we thought we had this amount of free will, and now we have this amount of free will, which is 20% less free will than we thought we had before. No, I mean, like, totally gone. And when free will totally leaves the scientific frame of the universe, you can say goodbye to any scientific analysis of morality, in which case all your dialectics concerning how society should be run go straight out the window, because moralism can no longer really be a perspective. Now, perhaps you could say, okay, well, we'll get rid of moralism and we'll bring in pure utilitarianism, but that creates a number of other questions, and it hasn't really worked in a realistic sense before. But again, I'm going a little bit too long about this, so I'm going to continue playing the video.
You see, I think liberalism has rather interesting features which are unfortunately often overlooked, not least by liberals themselves. Firstly, I don't think that liberalism is entirely independent. I think there's something in what communitarians say, in that we can't think of ourselves independently of our deepest commitments. Our sense of ourself depends, in a large extent, to commitments that we inherit from our nationality, our pro-national attitudes, our positive primordial passions towards that into which we are born. These are pretty much standard communitarian points, and I would actually agree with that. Where I differ from many communitarians is in that I think we do have a capacity to critically reflect in private on public conceptions of the good, both our own and those of others. So
yeah, again, if we're going to hold forth these Aristotelian dialogues, we need a concept of free will. If it's just not utilitarianism done by supercomputers in laboratories, then you need a concept of free will. So this is something that, I don't know, it needs to be addressed. It's something that, I don't know. We'll see where he goes with it.
Liberalism on its own doesn't have the resources to realise its values, but there is in liberal societies a capacity to do a certain thing, which is for rational self-reflection and reflection on other things, which isn't entirely exhausted by the community of which one is a part.
So, yeah, I get it. I get that. This is one of these frustrations with the skeptical liberals is, like, I get they like rational discourse, but they seem to think that liberalism or liberals are the only people that can do rational discourse, which just does not seem, doesn't seem right to me. The other thing is well, first of all, it doesn't seem right. It does not seem right. It's factually incorrect with what we know about history. We know that history, we know that rational discourse persisted in other societies that were not, by our own standards, liberal. And it seems to me that, like, they're trying to sort of patent discourse in a way that's really strange. Like, if you were sitting down with somebody and having a rational dialectic with facts, you're doing liberalism, like as if liberalism was a methodology. I guess perhaps he's going to answer this right now, because on the screen here it says liberalism is not neutral. So maybe he'll address this right now.
But liberalism itself, well, it is a conception of the good. It's not neutral. It can be self-reflective and self-critical. It can appraise the broader conception upon which public reason rests. It can't be decoupled, though, from public reason. There's an aspect of public reason in liberalism.
Oh, okay. If liberalism has values in the straight-up way that we're discussing here, then the skeptic community is a value-based community. And there's lots of corollaries from this. I think he is actually right about this. Liberalism is a value. It's sort of a minimalist value. It's a value of liberty above all else, in sort of a strong sense of the word. whether you're a progressive or whether you're a progressive liberal or a conservative liberal or a sort of a Paine type or Jeffersonian liberal. That is the value. But once we acknowledge that, liberalism is not some kind of default state. It cannot sort of get out of having conversations about fundamental goodness with other worldviews. And second of all, if we apply the principles that Gary Edwards just talked about in this stream, we could come to liberalism now and ask itself to justify its own concept of the good. And I really doubt it could support these things. I really doubt it could sustain the level of criticism for instance, or liberal thinkers of the past erected against Christianity.
It doesn't isolate national character from internal criticism, which I think is what conservatism tends to do. It doesn't entail parochial hypocrisy, like you can't criticise the in-group. I think conservatism has a tendency towards that, which liberalism is a useful antidote to. It doesn't see any criticism as being disloyal or an assault by some hostile other, which is again something that I think conservatism can fall into without the useful counterbalance of liberalism.
And this is actually one reason why I so love the liberal flower that grows in the garden of Christendom. The liberal flower that grows in the garden of Christendom. If I can say it, it's quite poetic, but it is indeed how I see liberalism. It is indeed a very beautiful flower, and it is very wonderful. It does allow us to criticize everything. It does shine light in areas that were very hard to see when traditionalist barriers were in the way. However, the question before us is whether liberalism with no constraint, if liberalism, if the flower, if the rose bush is not allowed to just to live in the garden and to exist in the garden in a certain place, but if it essentially consumes the garden and becomes the entire framework for how we view our interactions and our dialectic in every element of society, is that going to be sustainable? And I think it manifestly is not, because eventually this liberal criticism is going to start questioning the very frameworks upon which society relies, even upon which liberalism relies. And of course, I mean, the quintessential example right here is free will. If liberalism and I guess I'm sort of I'm doing sort of a sloppy mistake here. I am kind of conflating liberalism with skepticism, right? But in some sense, they are very similar, right? Because the liberalism he's talking about right here is the liberalism. It is the liberalism most directly associated with the skeptic project, and that is the liberalism of absolutely no sacred cows. We're never going to have a concept that cannot be hauled to trial. And, maybe you could do this with the proper, like I said before, maybe you could do this with the proper use of presumption and saying, okay, you can haul everything to trial, but these following principles of society are going to be presumed innocent, and in order to prove them guilty, you're going to have to get to this ridiculous standard of evidence that is at the level of physics, right? Because these are the foundational principles, and one of them might be free will, and other ones might be sexual norms. I know I probably disagree a lot with other liberals about how important these things are, but maybe you could do it that way. But the question is, if the principle of open questioning, if the liberal concept of open questioning is allowed to overrun everything else in the garden, is even liberalism going to survive? And I say it won't.
So yeah, I'm not a typical autonomous universalist neutral liberal by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think that liberalism is right about the plurality of a society. I think the empirical evidence is there for that, and for a certain capacity for private critical reflection. A basic outline is beginning to emerge that can be evidentially supported for that, and that's how I defend liberalism against the kind of criticisms that the distributist would make.
So, okay, points well taken. I don't think those two last points are under contention. I think that in most society, I mean, the question, I guess, what does he mean by pluralism? in one sense, to me, pluralism just means you have a lot of people with different points of view in one society. Sure, traditional societies have had various ways of incorporating this. I think Christian society always has had, Christian societies have always had a difficult time, to a certain extent, with incorporating minorities that are hostile to the Christian ethic, because Christianity is very high trust. It doesn't want a bunch of people in society benefiting from the trust and subverting it under the cover, under some other ethic that it doesn't control. In Islamic societies, they don't care about that. All they do is just make the people who are the pluralistic minorities occupy this separated class, of which the state is benefiting from, and has laws in place to constrain the growth of power of those communities. And and for a Christian society, because it wants to have this fundamental, not equality, that's the wrong word, but it wants to have this fundamental trust that pervades society and this fundamental universal moral law, it sort of frowned upon these ways of dealing with pluralism. And indeed, secular liberalism has been much more pluralistic. The question is now, I think, especially in our present world, is an infinitely pluralistic society always better? Is there some point upon which the pluralistic notion of we can tolerate any idea and we can give it the same deal regardless of what the idea preaches for the rest of society? I think that's going to be called into question. Now, I don't want to lump all Islam under the same umbrella, but to avoid controversy, let's just take something like the type of Islam promoted by ISIS. It's probably not Salafist, but you know what I'm talking about. The Salafist type Islam, the kind of Islam that promotes taqiyya, or is it? So taqiyya, the lying, the taqiyya, the lying for the sake of spreading Islam. If this is entered into society and it enters in a big demographic way, your liberal society is going to have a really hard time incorporating that, and saying, oh, pluralism, liberalism. It's sort of like what Fritz Imperial said about Kraut and Tea. You can't see somebody totally subverting your ethical system and go, well, that's not liberal. They'll just turn around and say, yeah, sure, we're not liberal. And soon we're going to be in control of your society because we're breaking its rules behind the cover of darkness, or behind the cover of our own community's ethics, which do not include reciprocation. And so, there ends your liberalism. So not your liberalism, there ends your pluralism. So the question really at this stage in the summary is not whether liberalism, this sort of purified liberalism is more pluralistic than tradition. I think in some sense it is more pluralistic. The question is, can liberalism ever develop an intolerance for plurality? Does it always just tolerate every ideology, even ideologies that are anti-liberal, and allow them to pervade its own institutions? This is the case. I've heard a lot of criticisms of liberals, and they're like, well, traditionalists aren't, they're pro-liberalism in a weak sort of way. They describe it sort of as a secondary value, as I just did in this stream. And indeed I do. But the thing is here is, I'm not so sure that, the question is, well, if liberalism is your only value, what's going to stop it from suffering the same fate? And let's see, not to use a too close example, that liberalism suffered in the universities. The universities they weren't handed from Christians to progressives. They were handed from Christians to liberals like Edwards. And then liberals like Edwards handed them over to progressives. That's the history in a short space of the liberal institution. And you're going to have to provide me some explanation of how that happened. Now, I know progressives are terrible, but the Christian worldview, it held a lot of forces in check for a very long time. There barely was a single generation of liberals who held the university system. In one generation, it went from Christian, and then in one generation it went liberal, progressive, and now even liberals like Ben Shapiro are are they on universities? They have a hard time even getting platformed, because the liberal principle was never really, it was never, the progressives and the liberal principle was always opportunistically embraced by a large percentage of people who were in the liberal coalition. A lot of people just wanted to essentially promote progressivism, and they used liberalism as a mechanism to do that. And so the question is, at some point, something more is going to have to be added, if indeed liberalism is just purely purely pluralistic, as and again, I don't know what he means, but I think that's what he's insinuating. But were we over here?
Anyway, I hope that made sense. Thank you for listening.
Okay. Yeah, I think it did make sense. I do feel like it might be a little bit incomplete. It left me at many times trying to respond to what I think Edwards meant, as opposed to perhaps what he did mean. But I think the question is not, is liberalism good? And that's what we really have to get over here, right? It's how do you set up the boundaries, and how do you add something else in that will protect it? So I just noticed Son of Tiamat said conservatism preserves liberalism, liberalism preserves nothing. Yeah, there's some truth to that. R.C. Jack says, how do you feel about Grodem as... Okay, well, I that's sort of off topic. In any case, I noticed that I went kind of slowly through that one, so hopefully the next one by King Crocoduck will be a little bit faster. I think I saw King Crocoduck in the chat. I will try to be as fair as possible.
I recently had a conversation with the YouTuber The Distributist, which is a channel I highly recommend in spite of our disagreements.
Oh, very, very nice. Thank you.
We discussed the future of the West in terms of how we ought to decide how issues get resolved. My preference is for a liberal society composed of a critical plurality that engage in reason and evidence-based discourse over the issues before deciding, democratically, how to incrementally adjust the parameters of society in order to acquire data on how it functions, and then responding accordingly to the consequences. The Distributist, by contrast, longs for a return to a tradition-based society where it is principally the Church which upholds and maintains Western society by imposing from above the standards and principles that the masses ought to subscribe to, which will not necessarily be open to discussion and debate.
I think that's a pretty fair summary. I mean, I'll offer some corrections. I certainly don't see, even in an ideal society, and I'm a person who by their very nature stays away from ideals. People ask me all the time, what's your ideal political system? My ideal political system is a system that's well suited for the present culture. And I think that different political systems are suited for different eras of human culture. And I think a great example is that this is the Roman Empire. I don't think that the Roman Republic could have been viable in the size of the empire, the size of the Roman Empire that was post Julius Caesar. And so in many ways the empire was necessary. So I'm a person that stays away from ideals. But insofar as I look forward into my ideal society, and I notice that, insofar as I look into my future society and try to ascertain, who's going to set up the rules, I see it being a variety of institutions, not simply the church. If you look to people in the Middle Ages, especially the two main political parties, the Ghibellines and the Guelphs, they were largely arguing over who, in addition to the church, should be an authority in society. And sort of the more popular party, the Ghibellines, were people who believed that secular and religious authority both in turn shared responsibility for upholding society's morals. So I think that there is a role for a lot of traditional institutions to play a part. And I would say that the church is its role has always been part of a larger tapestry. Now, I think in a lot of ways it's the most important, but again, I think this might be a little bit of a digression. I don't think it's what institution is going to uphold the tradition, really just the relative importance of a traditional perspective when we're running dialectic. But I'll continue.
I've linked in the description box the hour-and-a-half discussion that we had, along with a half-hour-long follow-up video he made reflecting on the discussion and clarifying his thoughts and objections to my worldview. This video is basically a clarification of my own thoughts and objections to his worldview. I would like to remark beforehand, however, that this is not an attack on the Distributist. I'm not saying this in order to reassure him, he already knows this. I'm saying this for the benefit of potential interlocutors into our discussion. This is not an argument, it's a dialectic. He and I are in the business of crashing our ideas against each other and leaving you, dear viewer, to pick up the pieces and perhaps craft from it an even deeper truth.
That's a good perspective. I always appreciate people who are able to have really calm discussions. And I think, I know Stargrind gets a lot of crap over various positions, but I think he's one of those people too. Certainly the academic agent. I think he and I both fly off the handle a little bit in front of Marxists, but it's always good to have a dialectic.
Cultivating a deeper appreciation for such discourse and spreading it through the skeptosphere is a goal that both of us share. So without further ado, here's a kind of...
well, maybe the skeptosphere might be... we need a better name for that.
impromptu response to everything that has been said thus far. A recurring theme in the videos of the Distributist is the belief that the contradictions inherent to modernity have destabilized society, that the foundations of Western civilization, which have allowed it to survive and have its memes propagate throughout the generations, have been recklessly abandoned, leaving the edifice of Western society dangling precariously over the abyss, which is inhabited by the most toxic threats to society, both internal and external. He envisions a return to a traditional society where the foundations that made the West stable are returned to their rightful place, keeping us from falling into the abyss. In such a society, it would be necessary to suppress deviation from the traditional consensus, either through coercion or public shunning, because it would have the potential to destabilize society and cause it to collapse into the abyss.
That is a little extreme statement in my position, but it's more or less accurate. I would argue that I think that everyone sort of imagines the core premises of society to be guarded by something, and we would all prefer that those premises be guarded by something maximally non-coercive, right? So even liberalism thinks that free speech, the idea of free speech, should be guarded by something. If you came up to a liberal and went, "Oh, do you believe that we should shun those who don't think that you should have freedom of speech?" he probably would say no. I think that, and I know this is quibbling over a detail, but I think that a liberal would say something like, "Well, I think it just should be obvious. It should be an a priori assumption. It should be something that we're raised with, we're taught, we're educated in." And I think that, for the most part, we're arguing over the premises and presuppositions of society. We're not imagining like a scarlet letter. I don't want to put a scarlet letter on ContraPoints for being against my preferred sexual morality any more than I'm sure King Crocoduck wants to be put a scarlet letter on ContraPoints because she doesn't think we should platform Richard Spencer, right? We both disagree with her on fundamental issues about how we should set up society, but we don't want to take that individual and make them suffer some horrible consequence. Although we could argue what we would be willing to do in order to actually save the society at the most basic level.
The Distributist is then, perhaps, like the Grand Inquisitor from the Brothers Karamazov, except instead of reluctantly constraining people's free will for the purpose of getting them into heaven, the Distributist will be reluctantly constraining people's critical faculties for the purpose of keeping society from collapsing. How exactly he intends to achieve such a state of affairs, the Distributist never specifies, and indeed, I suspect that his pessimism is owed largely to him suspecting that such a society will never be achieved.
Well, by the way, people should read Brothers Karamazov. That's the example he's citing here. Yeah, so I think his interpretation of that particular passage from the Brothers Karamazov is a little naive. I think that in a lot of ways, the Grand Inquisitor was much more of a reactionary, looking to preserve society as opposed to a religious fanatic. But I'll just digress. I already answered his question about the means to achieve these things. I think it's more or less it's more or less, our means are the same. It's the premises we think need to be protected that are different.
At least, not on our terms. Perhaps on Saudi Arabia's terms, but certainly not our own.
Oh yeah, and I am a pessimist. I don't think that it's impossible. I think that traditional values will come back. I just wonder exactly how much the hit's going to have to be in order for them to come back. I think that in many ways, traditional values, they are enforced by hardship. Hardship is the author of traditional values because, as I said before, a large amount, and then there's two, I am repeating myself, I know, so I apologize, chat, but there's two mechanisms, of the naturalistic mechanisms, I'll say this, there's many more than two, but of the naturalistic mechanisms, of which I do not need to appeal to metaphysics or to religion, there's two ways in which tradition is an information-carrying object, or as a naturalist would say, there's two ways in which tradition is a information-carrying emergent object, right? The first way that tradition is an information-carrying object is the fact that previous generations intentionally are teaching their best knowledge to the next generation. And so there's a very slow effect in which bad ideas are getting weeded out. The second way that The second way in which tradition becomes an information-carrying object is that not only are previous generations intentionally pushing forward their best ideas, the best ideas are the worst ideas are getting weeded out by the process of hardship. They're not surviving, they're not reproducing themselves, the best ideas carry on. And so this doesn't mean there can't be bubbles or fads. I talk about fads and intellect all the time, but over 1,000 years, the fads are all going to die out, right? Over 50 years, fads can carry on for as long as they will. So you know that the tradition that's 1,000 years old is very unlikely to have something that is, frankly, something that will destroy society. Now, the reason I think we might agree with this, and maybe he'll repeat this later on in this video, hardship makes tradition sharper, and long periods of wealth make it sloppier. Because during long periods of wealth, we forget the reason for wisdom. We forget the reason why people say we should be frugal with money. If we have a lot of money, we'll spend it on anything. People will push the constraints as far as possible. And so you might be taught by your grandmother to pinch your pennies. But if you live with a trust fund, if you live with no constraints, that tradition is going to seem antiquated and old and stodgy. It's only the people who actually have to form a budget who will understand the wisdom of grandmothers telling them to pinch their pennies. And for that reason, I think he's absolutely right. No, I think tradition is coming back, but it's coming back not with a whimper, but with a bang. Now, I don't like predicting doomsday, but it's a question of how big that bang will be. And maybe it'll be so big that what King Crocoduck is saying here is correct. Maybe it'll be so big that the only thing that will be left will indeed be non-Western things like Saudi Arabia. But I'll let him go on.
Because of time constraints, we were not really able to get into the meatier, juicier aspects of the conversation, and indeed I spent most of the time trying to clarify my own view of how society ought to address its problems, without first being able to frame it with a little context. I spent no time at all attacking the Distributists' vision of how society ought to be run, so I'm going to kill two birds with one stone right now by first elaborating on how I think human beings, and by extension society, function, and why my belief in how we function precludes the possibility of us ever returning to the traditional mode of thought. From there, I'll lead into how the problems posed by our natural and material conditions can potentially be addressed, before concluding with a very brief elaboration of how I conceptualize the open society. I'm going to frame my position by making the following claim, from which the entirety of my appraisal of the world follows. Our culture, and the specific features that it has, are principally the consequence of both our human nature, as understood by Hobbes and Darwin as opposed to Rousseau and Marx, and the material conditions that underlie it. The development of a civilization is inextricably linked to both the material conditions of that society, which is parameterized by both the immediate availability of natural resources and the capacity to trade with other civilizations, and human nature, which is defined in terms of our natural history and the genes that it shaped. Culture is downstream of both our intrinsic nature and the material conditions.
Okay, I'm going to pause it here. So, I don't know. Well, this will be a continuing dialogue between me and Crocoduck. So, the criticisms here, if I'm misunderstanding what he's saying, I'm sure I'll just make another follow-up video. But let me just unload on what there's a fundamental problem here with, I think, the case that he's going to make. If culture is the product of simply nature and material conditions, there's no need for dialectic. There's no need for the rational discussion that Edwards promoted in the last video I played, and that King Crocoduck played in our King Crocoduck mentioned in the video, the conversation I did with him. They both said, in some sense, that we could mold the culture, we could mold the norms. So I like this model. I think it's perfectly fine. If this model is supposed to convey to me that nature and material conditions play a role in culture, I'm 100%. If this model is meant to convey to me that those are the only or primary ones, or the only ones worth talking about that mold culture, then this totally undermines the entire liberal argument at its conception, right? Because there's no human will in this. There's no dialectic. There's no free will. There's no determination. There's no science. There's no nothing. So at this point, if this is the model, we can all pack our bags up as sociologists and philosophers and go home and play video games and smoke pot, because, nature isn't going to change. Human nature is not going to change, and the material conditions, people in Silicon Valley largely control those, but certainly not people talking about ideas on YouTube. So I'm going to assume this is a simplified model, but we'll go on. Actually, there's some questions here. I know there are a bunch of them. I know I can't answer all of the questions, guys. I'll have to answer super chats, certainly. I will answer super chats, and I will thank the people who post them, but I'll have to not, I won't get to all of the questions that are simply at replies. Some people asking me, would sexual ethics change because of contraception? That's what the claim was. That's what the claim was in the 60s. And I think that the evidence we have is that it didn't actually change the reality of family formation nearly as much as it's the proponents of the pill said it did. Would some kind of scarlet letter shunning be necessary to defend liberal values? It never was in Christian society. It might be if your population was 50% Muslim or 50% Salafist Muslim. You might need to actually enforce it. Preferred pronouns. Okay, I don't know, man. Preferred pronouns. At the moment, I'm kind of using them. I'm kind of using them with a caveat that I explicitly say that gender is not real. That's the compromise I have currently. I might put more thought into it, but again, that's a digression. Let's stick to the topic. So we're going to see if the simplified model for culture gets any more sophisticated. I'll press play.
One of these parameters has not, as yet, been open to a great deal of modulation. Human nature hasn't changed significantly in the time of written history, though with the introduction of new technologies like CRISPR-9, that could potentially change. Our material conditions, on the other hand, have changed significantly, and especially so during the Industrial Revolution. If the Marxists were right about anything at all, it's that the base has an enormous impact on the superstructure. Societal norms are largely a function of the material conditions that underlie it. Change them significantly, and societal norms will likewise change.
Yeah, I mean, it's the way these propositions are being used and what they're being isolated from. It's like the free will question, right? Like, a lot of scientists, when they question free will, they act like, oh, we just mean that there's less free will, but there's still something called free will. If that's the case, it's not a radical notion. If the case is that material conditions influence society or influence society to an enormous extent, that's not radical. It wouldn't have been radical even in 1848 when Marx wrote the main body of his work. This is something that it's something that almost all philosophers would have conceded to. Now, Marxism is unique because it says that this little m, the small m you see on the screen here, it says that small m is the only thing that influences society to such an extent that, one of the main controversies in Marxist science was it believed so much that the small m was the thing that controlled C. It essentially censored scientists that said that big N had any role, which was the whole purpose of Lysenkoism, right? Lysenkoism was this alternative to Darwinism that said that, material conditions, not survival, control evolution. And maybe I'm getting that wrong. It was something called Lamarckism too that said that, and I think it was roughly equivalence. But I could be wrong about the specifics of that particular thinker. But at any rate, Marxism was unique not because it said material conditions influence, but because it said that basically only material conditions influenced. Hence why Marxists called history dialectic materialism, because all of history was a conversation between different levels of this small m here, of different levels of the material condition. And that's what made it unique.
Take a group of 17th century Brits and settle them in Jamestown, America. I don't care how much British politeness or Western civility you've been socialized with. When the untamed swampy environment fucks your crops up and makes the town go hungry, cannibalism and infanticide are going to start taking hold. I don't care how much enlightened communist re-education you've been given in order to make you love every comrade as though they were your brother. When the Nazis blockade your city of Leningrad and prevent basic rations from entering into the city for months, cannibalism and infanticide are going to take hold. I think that this is a relatively uncontroversial view.
Yeah, but I think the interesting thing is that some societies, when they are fully fed, will still cannibalize outside groups. And some societies, even though they're very advanced and can build large pyramids, will perform human sacrifices. And other ones won't. We have Carthage and Rome, if we want to take an old world example. We have, to use the sort of stereotypical example, we have the Aztec civilization, if we want to take a New World one. So, yeah, I don't know. The fact that material has an influence is not the issue.
When times are rough, priorities change, and social norms get readjusted. That's just life. But I want to postulate a much more intriguing possibility. I want to suggest that when times are great and resources are abundant, the incentives that shaped traditional society cease to have as much of an influence, and the foundations of traditional society begin to erode. I do not believe it is a coincidence that the suffragettes began to envision new, non-traditional roles for women in the wake of the Industrial Revolution.
Okay, so this is not a proposition you bring against traditionalism or reaction. This is a central principle of tradition and reaction. This proposition that King Crocoduck said right here. This is exhibit number 1 in almost any reactionary view of the world. This is literally the Mencius Mollbug / Spenglerian cycle, the interplay between decadence and material wealth. And I think I just restated it about 20 minutes ago. Traditions are less sharp under conditions of high prosperity. We've seen this again and again. Absolutely right, King Crocoduck. But this is not this. You're making my argument for me.
I do not believe it is a coincidence that the abolitionists largely came from the North, which was the primary beneficiary of cheap industrial labor, as opposed to the South, which had a rural agrarian economy in which enslaved farmers were a far cheaper option and for which no significant industrial advances would develop for decades. And finally, I do not believe it is a coincidence that the will for women's financial and sexual independence chiefly arose during the post-war boom and the accompanying rise of the service sector economy, as well as the development of the birth control pill. The changes in family dynamics that the Distributist laments would not have been possible in a society where women still relied on men to go out and hunt for meat before giving them the opportunity to pass on their genes in exchange for a seat at the table.
Totally agreeing here. It's almost, hearing this from a liberal, it's almost like, it's like a revolutionary going up to a monarchist and then the monarchist telling him, oh, did you know all men were created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights? And the revolutionary would say, hey, that was what I was saying. Maybe we agree more than we think.
It is indisputably the material conditions of society that are the principal culprit for the erosion of traditional values. Now, just to clarify, this is not Marxism. I do not believe in historical destiny, I do not believe in the noble savage, and I don't believe that the interaction between base and superstructure is dialectical. What I believe is that the superstructure has to have certain characteristics, those that characterize Karl Popper's open society, in order for scientific advancement, and consequently the material conditions of society, to thrive, which in turn will disincentivize people from participating in traditional norms.
Okay, now here we have the disagreement. This is, and so we went from something that almost all traditionalists or reactionaries would agree with, namely that traditions and moral systems that are set up over time become less sharp and become less followed as wealth in society increase, and not only that. Oppressive social institutions or authoritarian social institutions also lessen. I think both, even people like me who are traditionalists who highly value liberalism, I have to admit that the same decadent force that unseats good traditions also tends to unseat bad ones. Slavery and other things that I think are frankly inhumane were unseated by the very forces of industrial progress that in many ways blinded us to a lot of problems that Western man has might now be suffering from because of too much wealth. But I think here we see really disagreement pop up, because King Crocoduck makes several propositions that I think are false, or he did in that last sentence. The first one is that liberal society or the Popperian society is necessary for dialectic to go on. It isn't. It just manifestly isn't. We have too much history. Dialectic, it only goes on among intellectuals. We need to get that out of the way straight up. There's this democratic notion that we have that dialectic is something that everybody does. It isn't. We've mistaken with democracy and republicanism, and they have their strengths and weaknesses like everything else. But their strength is basically, it's not to engage in this high-level dialectic of which King Crocoduck. It's not to be Socrates. Every person in a democracy or a republic is not supposed to be Socrates. It's just supposed to be a stopgap so that the demos or the people act as a counterbalance against people who have really bad ideas. It's a veto power on mistakes at the elite level. It's not assuming that conversations go on in a Popperian sense at every level because society is completely open and we have a marketplace of ideas. And because of this, dialectic of the type he's talking about, it occurs only at an elite level because only elites have the intelligence to actually talk about this. Second of all, we know just from looking at history that this type of dialectic existed in all types of societies. Moreover, especially when it comes to traditionalist Christian ones, the dialectic that directly led to the sexual revolution came right out of the Reformation. And the Reformation, in many ways, was the high watermark of religiosity. So, and this creates sort of the irony, this creates sort of the Spenglerian cycle that traditionalists and reactionaries are very fond of. They see sort of a cycle whereas, the moral systems are built up, and then eventually they create this moral system that produces high insight and high wealth, and then this sort of degrades and falls into ruin. And indeed there is that feedback loop, but you don't need pure liberalism to create the dialectic to begin with. In many ways, it's more of a result than it is something that. It's the causality that's the wrong way, right? The dialectic creates wealth. The wealth creates liberalism in a lot of ways.
Where this leads, I have no idea. The process is teleonomical rather than teleological, so it doesn't culminate in any kind of utopian synthesis, and in fact potentially leads to disaster. If I were to draw a picture of the shape of history, it would not be the zigzag of Hegel's dialectical historicism, but Darwin's tree of life, where society goes wherever the boundary conditions allow it, and where those versions of society that are so incompatible with human nature that they decline and go extinct make up the dead ends of this tree of history.
Yeah, I would agree with this. I mean, in some sense, it does do that, right? But the question is, King Crocoduck, or I'll just say everyone who's listening, the question is, if we're looking at this picture, right, this tree, the tree would be all of the possible ways society could go, right? Because it's just the boundary conditions. So the constraints of the tree itself, that is basically the vaguest possible view you could possibly get on society. That's not the interesting thing. The interesting thing is not the fact that, here's, this is what's not allowed, this is what succeeds. The question is, if we zoom out long enough and we see that there are certain branches that are pruned and certain branches that are not pruned, can we come to any conclusions about what branches are pruned and what branches aren't pruned? Are there going to be patterns? Which societies failed, which societies succeeded, which families failed, which families succeeded? And this is not a gotcha, but this is sort of the point. There's a word for us recognizing the pattern. Beyond just the boundary conditions, there's a word of humanity recognizing the patterns of which branches succeed and failed. And the recognition of that pattern is called tradition.
My project, and the project of the Open Society more generally, is to help steer society clear of these dead ends. But before I elaborate on what this entails, I want to take a moment to discuss an experiment that is really pivotal to my vision of the world, and that is the Great Mouse Utopia.
Okay.
The experiment took place in a box.
Pardon me, I'll have to stop here. Now, someone told me about this video. I know that King Crocoduck must not talk to many reactionaries, because this is like the reactionaries' favorite. This is the reactionaries' favorite example. This in many ways, the Mouse Utopia is the motivating example for all of tradition, for all of the traditionalist reactionary worldview. And it really amazes me seeing him bring this up because that this is Brer Fox and Brer Bear throwing Brer Rabbit into the briar patch. Don't throw me into the briar patch. Don't whatever you do, liberal, don't show me the Mouse Utopia. That will destroy my argument. The Mouse Utopia is where my worldview and my critique of liberal society was born. We'll see his reaction. And no, I'm not going to explain it because I highly suspect this is a 20-minute video. He's probably going to explain it himself. But this is something that reactionaries are very familiar with.
2.5 meters by 2.5 meters by 1.5 meters, where food, water, and nesting areas were distributed evenly and within a radially symmetric setup. Mice could enter tunnels that ran 3.5 feet up the box's walls, with every 8 inches of the tunnels containing portals to nesting areas. The setup had, in short, everything that a mouse community needed to thrive: abundant food and water, a genetically healthy starting population, ideal temperature, ideal weather, and absolutely no predators. Moreover, the scientists conducting the experiment would regularly come in to clean the waste and change the material of the box in order to prevent the transmission of disease. It's important to note that even though this experiment is frequently popularized as an overpopulation experiment, the carrying capacity of the setup was 3,840, and yet the population of the mice never exceeded 2,200.
Good. I'm glad he mentioned that. If you bring up the Mouse Utopia experiment to progressives, they'll try, people, they'll usually dismiss it as saying, well, this doesn't actually occur. It's really something, the Mouse Utopia experiment is really just about the carrying capacity of societies, and it's really a precaution against overpopulation, right? But I'm really glad King Crocoduck brought up the fact that this is not overpopulation. This is a fact about resource abundance. But, and I'm not going to reply a lot here. He's describing the experiment like way better than I could. I mean, I'd have to actually get notes together, so he's doing a yeoman's job here. So I'm just going to let the video play.
At least 20% of the nesting areas were left unoccupied even at peak population, and resources were never scarce. so in reality, this experiment showed the effects of excessive material conditions. After the introduction of a sufficient number of mice to ensure healthy genetic diversity on day 1, the experiment began. On day 104, the first litter was born, after an initial period of adjustment and the establishment of territories. From that point forward, the population exploded, doubling an average of every 55 days. It's worth noting that even though resources were evenly distributed, the births of new litters were not. Their distributions correlated strongly with the locations of the most dominant male mice, which the female mice were more naturally inclined to mate with. As ever, intrinsic nature was a non-negligible factor in the social structure. The radial distribution of resources did not produce a radial distribution of births, because nature has the first and final say. Starting at day 315, the population growth stagnated, now doubling an average of every 145 days. This was despite the plentiful resources that were available, as well as the fact that there were more mice available to breed than ever before. The stagnation in birth rates was accompanied by marked changes in behavior among both male and female mice. New mice became increasingly socially withdrawn, though would frequently lash out at other mice within their generation. A noticeable increase in scabs, chewed tails, and scar tissue was observed during this period. Sexual deviancy became increasingly common, with males mounting other males with far greater frequency, and females began taking on increasingly male-specific traits, such as defining and defending their territory, now that the males were too socially isolated to be inclined to do so themselves.
Wow, that sounds eerily familiar, doesn't it? Males started breeding with other males, that increases. Homosexual behavior increases. Females start taking on masculine roles. Males become disinterested, isolated, and atomized. What society sounds very much like that in the present world?
This was accompanied by a decrease in maternal behavior, with nursing periods becoming significantly shorter and pups becoming increasingly neglected by their mothers. Meanwhile, a new type of male, dubbed the beautiful ones, spent all of their time eating, sleeping, and grooming without ever fighting other males or attempting to socialize with female mice. Even when taken out of the great mouse Utopia and placed in environments with healthy, fertile female mice, the beautiful ones simply refused to breed. They merely continued with their self-grooming, eating, and sleeping habits. They were the mice going their own way.
You could also say they were the herbivore male mice.
On day...
Oh, pardon me. By the way, that's a phenomenon in Japan, where many men decide that they do not want to have anything to do with women, and they just focus on grooming themselves and being social.
560, population growth abruptly ceased and began a steep decline. The last known conception took place on day 920. Cannibalism occasionally transpired, and virtually all female mice engaged in the maltreatment and neglect of their young. The
child abuse, stagnating population, low birth rates. This is the reactionary view of where our society is headed.
Experiment was finally terminated on day 1588 due to the extinction of the great mouse Utopia. Now, of course, such experiments are obviously highly contentious, but my interpretation of what happened is that the material conditions differed significantly from those which informed the natural history of the mice, incentivizing them to behave in a manner that was so contrary to their nature that they began raising their young in increasingly dysfunctional ways, making subsequent generations behave in a manner even more contrary to their nature. This cycle of increasingly destructive behavior continued until the extinction of the population. Analogously, I believe that the changes in our behavior as a consequence of material conditions that have become increasingly divorced from those that have influenced our natural history causes us to behave in a manner that is contrary to our nature. The difference being that we're not locked in a box that's divorced from the outside world and its many predators and competitors, and that power tends to be consolidated by people who have the capacity to do irreparable harm to the world.
Okay, so I haven't heard a single thing that I disagree with here. I mean, it's unquestionable that decadence and societal decline comes from wealth. That this is foundational to the reactionary or traditionalist view of the world. The question now is, are we like mice or can we do something about this? Again, if the point is that this model does not have an element of agency in it, then, I guess it sort of refutes traditionalism, because no one can hold back the Mouse Utopia. But insofar as we are not just working off of instincts, insofar as we have any volition, I'm really interested to hear what liberalism's solution to the Mouse Utopia is. Because, maybe he's going to provide one here, but one of the big criticisms of liberalism, one of the big criticisms of Richard Dawkins style or libertarianism or any of these other technocratic worldviews, it doesn't have any solution to overabundance of material. It sees that basically as the benefit we should work towards. Frequently, the objective of and I'm not saying Crocoduck necessarily believes this, but frequently from the perspectives of people like George Soros, the entire goal of society is to make that little m as high as possible. If, for some reason, there is a bad thing that results in that high m, the material conditions being very, very high, we've got a big problem on our hands.
But what's essential to recognize is that the root of all of this is the change in our material conditions. And what this means for the traditionalist is that there is no going back to the good old days. The material conditions will simply not allow it. In a world where more people than ever before have an abundance of leisure and resources, it is just as impossible to return to the days where fornication and sodomy were frowned upon as it was for pre-industrial European women to participate in hookup culture.
Okay, so what's the solution to the Mouse Utopia? What's the solution to the Mouse Utopia? If he has a solution to the Mouse Utopia, and it does not involve modifying, so this was really the thing. He's saying, okay, well, you can't control it because it's completely controlled by material conditions and human nature, so you can't control culture. Well, if you can't control culture, what's the point of having your rational dialectic? If you can't control normative culture, what's the point of having a bunch of sociologists do things on a chalkboard? They're not going to reduce the material conditions. So all you're doing is shooting down any reason for us to be on YouTube talking to each other. You're not actually refuting traditionalism. Now, I'm going to let this go on for a little bit longer, but I think that depending on what he says here, this might open up a huge difficulty. I think traditionalism does have an answer to the Mouse Utopia, and did, in fact.
Things like feminism are neither emancipatory movements nor expressions of degeneracy. They are the mechanisms by which the terms of the social contract are renegotiated in order to stabilize the culture in the light of the changing material conditions.
Okay, if feminism is indeed part of the process that caused the same type of process that in the Mouse Utopia caused the colony collapse, I think it is absolutely correct to, in that case, it would be in a sociologically sense, absolutely right to call it degeneration, because the Mouse Utopia literally degenerated.
When this variable changes, the whole function changes, and the traditionalist is not able to do anything about it, no matter how much they want this term to stay constant.
Can the liberal?
You literally have to smash up the machines and then burn the knowledge used to create them in order to create a configuration of society that resembles the good old days. It would be like M. Night Shyamalan, or whatever his name is, that movie The Village, which appears to take place in colonial America, but in reality is set in the present day in an isolated forest community that was created to mimic the good old days, in order to create a simpler and supposedly better way of life.
Okay, so The Village, it's a bad movie by M. Night Shyamalan. It largely mimics the behavior of Anabaptists on the one hand and the Puritans on the other. And perhaps you people can already see how my critique is forming up when I make this. The Anabaptists and the Puritans were reacting from decadence and overconsumption and really, really bad behavior of the Catholic aristocrats in Europe. I know I'm a Catholic. I know I'm a huge opponent of radical Protestantism, but their initial impetus was correct. And in many ways, you could argue that the puritanical morality that was brought in as a reaction to decadence, decline, and degeneration in the upper classes resulted in the Protestant work ethic that we've attributed so much of our success. When I say our, I mean England and America, of which we have attributed so much of the success of England and America in the 18th and 19th centuries. Again, this could be seen as a mini Spenglerian cycle. So, perhaps the original Puritans and Anabaptists, who themselves were somewhat, and they weren't Luddites because they used technology, but they were moral traditionalists in the sense that they were trying to make stronger, sharper morals. In many ways, their project was very successful.
And of course, you'd have to take everything that comes with that. Extreme poverty, disease, all of that shit. And even if you could somehow have a traditional society without changing the material conditions, you would be maintaining ancient habits and combining them with modern means.
Okay, this is another thing I don't understand. Why? I mean, the notions of moral enforcement have oscillated over society, right? So even, again, to bring up the Puritans were more socially conservative than the medievals. They were more socially conservative than most people in the Renaissance. This is why you have things like the Canterbury Tales, and you can't imagine the Canterbury Tales. I mean, it has lots of stuff about sex in it. It would never have been published in Cromwellian England. It would have never been published in Puritan Massachusetts. The controls over social behavior, they oscillate over time. Now, does that mean that by being more restrictive and religious in their practices, did the Puritans lose the technology of the musket? Did they lose the technology of the fast-moving caravel? Did they lose the technology of the clock, of the printing press? Of course they didn't. These things operate totally independently. Nor do we have reason to believe that, for some reason, traditionalists are more violent than their modern counterparts. We know that technology sort of creates less frequent wars, and in some sense that might lead to an overall less violence, but we have no reason to believe that people of a traditional persuasion are more likely to fight. I don't even know what this picture is. It's a mushroom cloud, and I guess it's just a mushroom cloud. I thought it might be combined with something else to make it look more traditionalist, like a Ku Klux Klan hood or something, but, well, whatever. Again, I don't see any evidence for this, so I'll keep on going.
There is no state of affairs in which such a configuration is stable in the long term. At the same time, the utopians' insistence on recreating the Great Mouse Utopia on a human scale is based on a similarly fallacious belief, that they and they alone know which of these paths leads to a great and stable civilization, often failing to properly consider human nature in their calculations, just as the traditionalist often fails to take the changing material conditions into account in their calculations.
Yeah, but this is the problem. The accusation from the traditionalist to the utopian is not that they're claiming a different type of traditionalist knowledge that we don't have access to, or even that they're doing it scientifically. The accusation of the traditionalist to the utopian is you're not actually looking at what types of branches survive and fail. You're looking at which branches you want to have survive in an ideal fashion, and then going down that path. Do you think John Lennon, when he wrote Imagine, thought that, in the past and in the future, societies where people sit back and have nothing to live or die for, or societies where we have no weapons and just smoke pot all day, that's more likely to survive than the industrial Puritans who work and make themselves busy with toil. Maybe he did think that the imagined society was plausible, but it certainly wasn't thinking that it was more likely to survive than its likely alternative. It was pure wishful thinking. He picked that society because it matched his own desires for what society should be, not that it conformed to what he thought would actually succeed. The traditionalist, and again, I'm using this. I'm molding my perspective only to include my materialist views. There are other reasons why I might believe this. But insofar as I believe in tradition as a sociologist, I believe that tradition is actually containing information about how those branches segment. That's the sociological reason for following tradition, is because tradition is an organic map of how those branches succeeded or failed well into the past, for thousands of years, before we even had an ability to record history. Before our oldest copper plates, tradition has carried forward information about how those past branches swung on the tree. So, if indeed this equation permits any meddling from the human observer, if indeed it's not just big N, small m, but there's some kind of x variable that we can turn like a knob, I'm going to turn that knob based on the information that's organically come to me through my tradition, because that, in many ways, is the best knowledge that we have. Again, we'll go forward and see this. Oh, I see that King Crocoduck is saying that I'm repeating him. If that's happening, then that's great. I guess it means we're agreeing. I'm listening to this, and I'm not so much disagreeing as I am just going like, this is exactly what I think. And this indicates that, I guess, I hope it's entertaining. I guess 200 people are watching, so it must be a little bit entertaining. But this indicates that we either have a very minor disagreement, or our disagreement is very, very subtle, and we're not parsing it out. But I think that we've come. I've pointed to some things that maybe it's me misinterpreting. But I guess I'm just going to call it like I see it. Again, I fully suspect that some things are going to be misinterpretations when I go through this. It must be really aggravating for King Crocoduck watching me do this video, but this is just the format that I'm taking. Sorry, man.
As with evolution, tradition bestows upon us both useful features that allow us to thrive, such as the family as the unit of society, and vestigial features, like the suspicion of everything foreign. Critical discourse...
That's funny, though, right? Because family as the vestigial unit of society and suspicion of the foreigner, these two traditional instincts are usually front and center in the Enlightenment attempt of deconstruction. Rousseau was against both of them. Engels was against both of them. Every one of the really radical Enlightenment people who went out there and tried to rebuild our notions of what was, what survived in society and what was superfluous crap, they all focused on those very two instincts as being prime examples of useless, superfluous crap that had nothing to do with what society actually needed in the modern world. So I keep interrupting. So
democracy is the mechanism by which this historical tree is navigated, removing the harmful vestiges of tradition whilst preventing the dangerous conflation between novelty and progress. The traditionalist and the utopian are joined at the hip in their flawed belief that they know what is best for society and how it ought to function, imposing by fiat a culture that may not be sustainable in the long term, and dismissing dissenters as deplorables or degenerates.
Yeah, but so is the counterfeiter and the honest banker. I think the question is, nobody would be choosing to make policy if they did not think they had some information about these branches, right? Even the liberal is claiming to have some knowledge about how these branches worked. That's the I don't know. If the attack is just on any attempt to influence how society runs, this would be a very coherent attack. But if we're having any kind of dialectic worth a damn, somebody has to be making some claim, right? And I guess the fact that we all make claims attaches us by the hip.
The point of the open society is to allow for an ongoing critical discourse to take place where we consider this naturalized model of how society works and use it to formulate hypotheses about how we can adjust to this or that variable. If our culture appears to be headed toward a historical dead end, we as an informed democracy can take note of this and agree to change track in a continuous process of conjecture and refutation. The advantages of starting from a naturalist...
Okay, so we can, in fact, change culture beyond material conditions. So we do have an X-knob. But wait, why did the X-knob suddenly become a thing when we discussed liberalism, but didn't become a thing when we discussed traditionalism? I mean, if we have an X, humanity either has an X knob that factors into the creation of culture in addition to the N and the M variables, or it doesn't. And if it does, then let's discuss how do we stop Mao's Utopia. Okay, one way we stop Mao's Utopia is we destroy all our shit. I get the sense that King Crocoduck does not like that example. Or he said it was impossible. The other way that we stop Mao's Utopia is we stop the secondary sex characteristics of Mao's Utopia by imposing some kind of cultural or normative standard on society. Now, liberals poo-poo this, but is there a third option? Am I missing something? Like, I guess the CRISPR gene. Like, that's the other one, right? We take the CRISPR genetic engineering technology and we literally edit human nature. Of course, that comes with all other sorts of unforeseen consequences. That could destroy society, and it could destroy society instantly. But I guess that would be a third option that wouldn't be traditionalism. But in leaving aside changing human nature, that's the only ones I can see. You either stop the material increase, or you find some kind of normative or cultural thing that you can actually implement in society, as traditionalists believe you can, and you cut off the secondary characteristics of the Mao's Utopia at the knees. Okay, so I'm getting the sense that the audio is too high. I asked this at the beginning, and people said the balance was all right. So maybe I'm going to modulate this so that last time it was literally the opposite. Last time it was the fact that the audio was too low. So I'm modulating it slightly. Okay, hopefully that's better. So I have had balance issues with this before. We're gradually getting there. So I'm just going to continue playing this.
View and engaging in piecemeal engineering from there will, I suspect, be elaborated upon to some degree by Gary Edwards, who as a philosopher of science is in a much better position than I am to articulate them when he gets around to making his response video. Nevertheless, I want to touch upon a couple of concerns that the Distributist had when it comes to this particular scheme. First, the tendency for fads to cloud our critical faculties is precisely why a critical plurality is needed to ensure that such circle jerks, when they materialized, are identified and dealt with. As Gary Edwards has said elsewhere, the marketplace of ideas isn't really a marketplace so much as it is an agora. There's more than just trading going on.
Well, that's the problem, though, isn't it? I mean, I really like the idea. I respect it, right? But I'm sorry, I'm going to have to be a skeptic here again, right? I mean, like, if the fads means that the errors aren't going to be independent, they're not, right? So we should. It's like a market, right? And this is the problem with markets too. Like, market trades aren't independent, and market decisions aren't independent. And because market decisions aren't independent, we have a problem, because now all of a sudden market errors are going to be correlated and you get bubbles, right? You get a positive feedback loop and you get big mistakes that cost people trillions of dollars. That's how you get the housing crisis. That's how you get the Depression in 1929. This is a problem. And the same thing happens in science because the errors aren't independent. And for less certain sciences, they're even less independent. And the big question here for people who think that science has some kind of solution to this, and Gary Edwards insinuated that they did have a solution, so maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they fixed this, but it would have to be a big fix, and it would have to be something that would be really revolutionary. How do you stop these fads from destroying our society if you're going to haul societal preconceptions that are essential onto the stage and have them torn apart by scientists? I mean, I'm sorry to go back to my stock issue, and I know I'll go back to this again and again, but it's just too big not to. Crocoduck acknowledges that the family unit is essential. He acknowledges that perhaps is that some notion of cultural discrimination or cultural loyalty, let's say, is necessary. Okay, so those two propositions are good traditions that help society survive. Sociology has torn those apart for 50 years. A consensus of sociologists have torn those apart for 50 years. And insofar as all of the scientific philosophers, there have been dissenters here and there, but for the most part, in the New York Times and in the consensus in all major universities, they've waved this through again and again and again. They've waved it through for so long that people who became professors in the 60s got tenure, trained a new generation of professors who got tenure, and they trained a new generation of teachers who are now teaching all of our children from kindergarten on to undergraduate, that this idea that the family unit is just a tradition from a past that has no relevance to society, this fad was so large that it essentially captured almost all of academia. So if this protection is in place, it must be a very recent development, or I'm sorry, but you're really shit at implementing it, because a big failure just got through your system.
I'd argue that being caught engaging in dishonest and underhanded tactics has a detrimental effect on a person's ability to convince others, even if they are correct. I think this has been borne out rather dramatically in last year's election. Being honest and honorable in the open society, in the agora of ideas, is still the best policy, because failing to do so may ultimately bite you in the ass. There is also the problem of indeterminacy of cause and effect in social science, which is another point that the Distributist raised. I don't think that it's necessary for our appraisal of the world to meet the standard of physics in order for us to use this conceptual scheme. You don't need to know exactly how this equation evolves over time. Making a little adjustment, collecting data, and deducing the general shape of the resulting curve should be enough to tell us whether we are, broadly speaking, on the right track.
Okay. So we're coming to the end of this video, and we're coming to sort of my discussion of it. I kind of want to leave some time where I can just discuss the abstract idea. And I saw a very good quote from King Crocoduck. I mean, this is a great video, by the way, guys. So I'm going to say the same thing about King Crocoduck that he said about me. Man, I respect this video. It's really good. He's an awesome YouTuber, and you should all subscribe to him. But now let me try to answer, this critique. I think we're at a point between me and King Crocoduck. There's not enough information to decide this definitively, whether science can nail a social phenomenon or not. The way that King Crocoduck is describing, it's an open question. I think it's open. I can be convinced maybe it can nail questions like this. And if it can nail questions like this, I think, it would be a very useful tool for humanity going forward. And to the extent that it works, I support it. And it is a beautiful flower in the garden of Christendom that I very much hope to cultivate. Now, here's a test question, though. Did the sexual revolution work? Because I think we have a ton of evidence saying that it didn't. If it didn't work, and we've got a scientific mechanism that demonstrates it didn't work, then it should be no problem using science to go into the academy and convince all of the sociologists within one generation, we'll allow for the changing of the guard to occur. But within 20 or 30 years, we should have a significant number of our sociologists using science, thinking that the sexual revolution was a mistake. I don't think we can do that. I don't think we can do that because I don't think that it works that way. But it's got to, right? It's got to work that way in order for this theory to work. This is a huge mistake. It's killing our birth rates. It's essentially taking us into a mouse utopia, as King Crocoduck himself pointed out. I mean, you listen to all those qualities: emasculated males, non-breeding populations, declining population rates, the beautiful one, the herbivore males, the increase in homosexuality, the increase in transgenderistic behavior in the mice. Every one of those properties is incident in our very societies. And the proximate cause of this, I'm sorry, it's the sexual revolution. Now, let's acknowledge it and see how much we can correct this mistake. And to the extent that we can correct this mistake, I will acknowledge we have a good mechanism through sociology to confront this mistake. But the mistake was made, so there's got to be some issue to be dealt with. And even if the mistake was made, and we can acknowledge it, in order for this mechanism to be good, we have to have some mechanism to turn this back. We have to actually fight this trend. We have to step away from the mass utopia. We made the mistake, but we can't correct it, We can't make the Academy acknowledge it made a mistake. And furthermore, using liberalism, we have no solution to take us away from the Mao's Utopia. And I'm sorry, liberalism has a huge problem here, right? Because liberalism essentially handed the reins over to Marxist professors that used their utopian ideology to destroy a fundamental institution of society. All of their critical liberal dialectic couldn't stop this idea of the family unit being not a good tradition from essentially becoming a consensus in most modern academic departments. And furthermore, the liberalism seems manifestly incapable of correcting its mistake and fixing the problem as it arose. And this is after 2,000 years of correctly defending this tradition under the Christian governance of these institutions. I'm not saying this is sufficient evidence to say that the traditional way of dealing with these issues is necessarily better, but I'm sorry, if this can't be corrected, this is a huge data point against liberalism. And we're going to have to deal with that data point somehow. I mean, it's a data point. It's also a huge problem, right? I mean, I don't want to suffer the fate of the Mao's Utopia, but that's the society. That's what we're facing down. That's what we're staring into. We're staring into the abyss of the Mao's Utopia as we speak.
When I call for a genuinely scientific social science, what I have in mind isn't a social science analog of physics, but a means of appraising society that is open to testing and revision in the light of new data. The conceptual scheme that I've put forward has the advantage of being dynamic enough to progress our culture in harmony with the changing material conditions, whilst still maintaining those aspects of tradition that are appropriate given the circumstances. And it is this superior dynamic of being neither too flexible nor too rigid that compels me to champion the open society.
Okay. Awesome. Awesome. That was the video changing, by the way. King Crocoduck did not, in fact, include a random clip of Noel Plum staring into the camera as his closing shot. Excellent video. Thank you very much, King Crocoduck. Okay. So it's apparent from me watching this video that we agree on a lot. We disagree on how effective this open discourse is in a very empirical sense. So now the question is, what can we do about it? And I see my moderator Blackjack saying he says it won't come back because of material condition. Okay, so the tradition is not going to come back because of the material condition, but somehow you're going to overturn the sexual revolution. I mean, somehow you're going to impose restrictions that are going to stop us from having masculinized females, effeminate non-breeding males, and a descent into a Mao's Utopia. Like, presumably you have some solution for this, or is it just that there's no solution? Because the thing is that this is the problem Sargon is having too, right? I don't know if it's a problem, but I notice that there's sort of a fundamental cognitive dissonance, if not in the ideas of Sargon, in how he presents himself. And that is that any attempt to go back to a traditionalist family is going to look like traditionalism. Even if it's liberals going, oh, no, I promise, we're promoting family values just because they're the best, because they're the best by utilitarianism. It's going to look like traditionalism to the extent that I can't see a big difference. I'm fine. I think that makes us allies in some sense. Like, if we're trying to avoid the fate of the Mao's Utopia, we're in many regards allies in this attempt, even if you come at it from a secular perspective and I come at it from a classical one. So it's not all that bad. But it does sort of create this issue that it seems like you're really trying hard to get around the fact that at some level you're going to have to be advocating for very similar policies to what Christians asked for religious and traditionalist reasons. And we're going to call them something different, but they're going to be the same. And I think that from my mind, it's going to be hard to convince me that they are not just two words for the same thing. Okay, so here's the second thing. The Mao's Utopia. Okay, so one perspective is, and the one that was certainly on display here, is that the Mouse Utopia, these abundance of material conditions existed. This is a new phenomenon. We saw it first in the Industrial Revolution, and we never saw this before. And we're seeing decadence emerge from it, which is inevitable because the more wealth, the more decadence. And human societies never ever had to deal with this. This is the first time we ever had the possibility of having more food than we know what to do with. This is the first time we've ever had a population that almost became a Mouse Utopia. In some sense, this is true. The Industrial Revolution has created an abundance that we've never seen before. But we've seen this kind of thing before. I know King Crocoduck is messaging me. I'm going to have to finish this thought. I'll try to answer your questions afterwards. We've seen this kind of thing before. And I would argue that the human race has seen overabundance since civilization began. We did not evolve for civilization. We evolved for hunter and gatherer societies. Hunter and gatherer societies have scarcity as a common element of their societies. We then moved towards farming and civilizational structures. What do farming and civilizational structures have? They have the ability to, for very long periods of time, sometimes for many generations, produce a massive overabundance of food and resources, far in excess of what the current generation can consume. So, in a strictest sense, human beings, and in particular civilized human beings, outside of their hunter and gatherer context, have always had the option of forming a Mouse Utopia for a certain number of generations. And the key is for a certain number of generations, right? Because I'm sure King Crocoduck will say something like, well, not indefinitely, they'd run out of food. And indeed, that's very much the case. But of course, in a Mouse Utopia, no human society would ever have to do it for would ever be able to create the Mouse Utopia indefinitely for themselves, right? They could never create the human equivalent of the Mouse Utopia for infinite generations, right? And neither can we. All the Industrial Revolution has done is create a society that might be able to create a Mouse Utopia for 3 generations into a society that could create a Mouse Utopia for humans for 30 generations. Now that's a big difference, right? That's a big difference, but it is just a difference in degree. So, given that the present generation of humans, and perhaps their children, can live in a Mouse Utopia, why aren't we living in a Mouse Utopia? And I'm going to bring up an example of another thing, in addition to the abundance of resources that emerged upon humans' transition from a hunter and gatherer society to an agricultural one, and that is religious morality. There is a reason why the Bible starts with Adam and Eve getting expelled from the garden and living in a civilization, or something that looks like a civilization. Because it's at this moment that humans became radically liberated from the direct constraints that led to their evolution. So, you see now that the Mouse Utopia is not divorced so much. It is connected to the material constraint, but in many ways, the traditional morality that developed in civilizations developed as a direct response to the possibility of something very much like the Mouse Utopia arising inside human civilizations. And you say, well, okay, we have civilization, morality and tradition come to confront the fact that we do not want the present generation consuming away the wealth that the next generations need to survive, and that we need the next generations to essentially have the moral structure to carry on the wealth-producing capacity of their ancestors, right? That seems like a stable system, and indeed it is. But as King Crocoduck said, right, wealth will increase because of progress, and eventually we begin to forget the institutions, and eventually the natural tendency of humans to consume exceeds our morality, and we become decadent and decline. And this creates the natural oscillation from a reactionary point of view. This is reactionary theory. This creates the oscillation of civilizations that we know so well from history. And again we see it. Again and again we see it. Civilizations rise in a bang, they die as they grow decadent, and they lose contact with the family values that made them great. And don't take my word from this. Camille Paglia, right? She's feminist, secular, atheist. Admittedly, she's a dissident feminist. She said quite clearly, she said again and again, as civilizations decline, transgenderism, homosexuality, sexual decadence, they go up. Did she make this up? No, she didn't make this up. She didn't even look at the Mouse Utopia. All she did was look at history, because they see it again and again. What Mouse Utopia does is it provides us with a sociological mechanism for understanding how this does work, and it works by an oscillating moral traditionalism. Now, the quintessential example of this, of course, is the Roman Empire, which eventually fell into ruin. But it doesn't end there. It doesn't end there, right? I guess the Roman Empire is a perfect example in some sense, because in that case, the original technological boom and the organization of the empire was such an enormous upswing that we have very good records, and we have a very good picture of what a decadent society looks like when that finally swings down, when the traditions that brought about the empire finally get eroded away. And the thing is, I think Christianity in particular, it was very good at avoiding this decadence. I mentioned earlier on the Puritans. The Puritans noticed the decadence that had emerged in Rome, emerging in their very own aristocracy. I know I'm a Catholic. I know in many ways I think the Reformation was a mistake. But the one thing it wasn't a mistake, the one thing it was not mistaken about, I should say, was noticing the decadence in the aristocracy, was noting the decadence and the corruption in the church. And it came on the heels of the Renaissance, an explosion in the late Middle Ages, an explosion of technology, an explosion of wealth, an explosion of trade. And in many ways, the Protestant Reformation, the Puritans, were a reaction against that. They were a remoralization of society. And similar things had happened before. Christianity was a remoralization of society. Catholicism of the late Middle Ages was a remoralization of society. And Christianity has been very, very good at, when the decadent impulse happens, sure, there's a decline. Sure, some elements fail. But after the elements fail, the tradition is reestablished, society is remoralized, and we're able to sort of continue on with our society as it happens. And this is the big problem with liberalism. Because in my mind, this link was cut. At this point where we are right now, where we are in our current society, we need to remoralize. We need to remember our traditions. We need to do what the Puritans did. We need to do what the Christians did. We need to do what the late Babylonians did. We need to reestablish what made our civilization great to begin with. We need to rediscover the moral systems. Christianity can do this. Can secularism? Can liberalism? I'm skeptical. I'm not going to lie. I'm skeptical that it can. I think in many ways it does not have a lot of the qualities. But maybe there are qualities that are compatible with an atheist worldview that will allow it to be that. But in many ways it hasn't shown them yet. Those have yet to be discovered. There's work to be done. And maybe we can work together to discover them. But it's needed. It's needed. Because, we can say that the Mouse Utopia is inevitable. Maybe it is. Maybe we've gone too far. Maybe our society is doomed to extinction. But if it's not, if there is an X variable that we can turn, then both me and King Crocoduck have got to be turning it. And we've got to ask ourselves whether secularism or Christianity or tradition turn that knob back away from libertinism better. Because I think we know that is essentially what has to happen at this stage in society. And again, I know for the Catholic listeners, I believe that this stuff is morally wrong in an abstract Aristotelian Platonic sense. I believe in objective morality. I believe it's objectively wrong. But my disagreement with King Crocoduck and Gary Edwards is largely sociological. So I'm answering this in a sociological way, and I think that's the question before us. And I think, as opposed to doing maybe another back and forth, maybe we could, if I could propose something with King Crocoduck. I don't know the answer. I'm not 100% convinced that you couldn't make your idea work. And we shouldn't quibble over percentages of confidence. What we should just say is, I'm a pessimist and a skeptic over liberalism's effectiveness at doing this, and you're more optimistic. And we could quibble over the details, and you could say that my pessimism is not warranted, and that's great. But But let's try to discuss instead, and maybe a more fruitful discussion is, how do we stop mass utopia? I really want to stop mass utopia because mass utopia. If the greatest, I love Western civilization. I love European culture. Oh God, that would be a depressing final chapter. Like we developed the most edifying literature, the greatest art. We went to the moon, and then we got home and we fucked ourselves to death. Like seriously, that's going to be the end. I'd personally prefer Genghis Khan. I'm sure it'd be less pleasant. In some sense, in a selfish sense, I'm sure society fucking itself to death would be pretty good for the societies as they participate in it. But oh God, it's depressing. I really don't want to go that way. So to the extent that we can possibly turn the X factor on that equation back a notch, we could dial it back. I think that should be our next discussion. Okay, so I finished that. Perhaps, okay, so this Noel Plum thing, it's really detached from the other two. I kind of want to do it because I kind of don't want to, miss it. I kind of put it off last time. This is doing, he's responding to my atheist response. So I'll try to link it in. Does anyone have any questions they want to send me before, I'm going to go off and get a drink of water and come right back. And we can finish this up. So, a slight intermission. Okay, so I'm back. Let's get through this Noel Plum thing really quickly. Go away from the pessimism. I'm trying, Blackjack. I'm trying. I really do think I'll be less pessimistic. But how was your day? Busy. Did a lot of driving today. Do you drink whiskey? Not really. My fiance does. Well, sparingly, I should say. Neither of us are whiskey connoisseurs. She's partial to Oban, though. How would you prevent professors from starting another sexual revolution? Do you think some sort of inquisition could help? I don't know. I think this establishing norms. Why do no professors challenge intersectionality in our present system? Is it because we have an intersectionality inquisition? Maybe that's coming, right? But that's in many ways because intersectionality is on its face such a ridiculous idea, or it's a really unuseful model. So I don't know. I think you can establish norms in academia, without having to do this medieval. It's not even medieval stuff. The Inquisition was not extensive through the Middle Ages. It was in particular instances of chaos. Norms can do this. One of the upsides of fads is that if you put the right fads in place, you don't have to continuously re-argue essential things. Society doesn't have to, every generation, take the gun out of the cabinet, put it in its mouth, and go, do I really want to blow my brains out? And decide, oh, I guess the balance of evidence is 51% against blowing my brains out, so I'm safe for another day. You can use norms to say, okay, it's not a good idea to jump off the cliff. What is your view on the European New Right? I have no idea what that is. I am sorry. I am ignorant. Yes, Blackjack. No one expects intersectionality inquisition. Okay, let's go on to the Noel Plum thing. I have no idea what to expect. So this one's different. This is the one apple that does not look like the others. This one is in response to my atheism series.
This is a video response to the Distributist. Kind of looking forward to this one, although it's not really aimed at me, the video. The video was called A Skeptic Challenge, and it was intended for bigger and brighter lights than my own. But unfortunately, I'm not... Well, I'm responding for two reasons, really.
Oh, come on. Noel Plum is one of my favorite atheists. I have respect him enough to... He's not an easy mark. He's not an easy mark. And so his videos always seem to be really... I mean, King Crocoduck and I, we're always thinking in the same way. And we're quibbling over small things, acute things, really critical things. But they're small mistakes, things that I can easily point to and say, okay, you chose this path in the woods, and I chose that one. And I think you're wrong. With Noel Plum, I find that his approaches go way different direction than I do. So this is always the problem. I have to deal with an intelligent person who's talking to a way different topic than I wanted to. Because usually the typical thing of having someone do that is to just make fun of them. But I know he's really smart and I respect him. So I can't do that. So I'm always don't know how to respond to this.
One, because I'm not entirely convinced that the Distributist is going to get a response from any of the people that he aimed the video at, and two, because it's something that I would like to tackle. So here is a response. First thing I will say with regard to this is that the video is called A Skeptic Challenge. And yet in it, he talks about atheists. He's talking to atheists, he's talking about atheists, he's talking about atheism and the spread of atheism and the effect that that could have, etc., etc., etc. But then kind of vacillates between talking about atheists and skeptics throughout the video. These are not the same things, and although some people might conflate it in the way they label themselves or talk about themselves, they are different things, and I think that it's not helpful to keep changing between those two things. So I'm just going to talk...
Yeah, I know... Yeah, well, the other thing about Noel Plum is he's very particular on the definitions, and I think when I say the atheist community, I mean like the standard 2008 stop being stupid Christians type atheists, where we kind of convinced ourselves that what was really wrong with the society was that we had too many superstitions. It was compelling in 2008, but I don't think this is a hard group to characterize. They call themselves atheists. They call themselves skeptics. I think he knows I don't mean communists when I say atheists here. Oh, higher volume on the video? That's the second... Okay, I raised it before, and then someone says it was all right. This might be a constant war, actually.
Talk about atheists as an atheist, as an anti-theist, as somebody who thinks that atheism is preferable in many ways to theism, and who would promote atheism from that perspective. Okay, so I want to respond to what was said here. Now, what I would usually do, my kind of modus operandi in these circumstances, as most of you will be aware by now, is to either show, to kind of try and find something within the original...
So this is as loud as it goes. Sorry. I could lower my volume, actually. Here, I'll relatively lower it here.
Video that sums up what was said in that video, or to intersperse what I have to say with what the person I'm responding to has said. I've listened through several times to this, and I cannot really find a way to slice it up for a number of reasons. One is just simply the way that the video is laid out. Two is that there is some ambiguity to the video. I'm not entirely sure what it is that the Distributist is asking for. So
this is sort of fair. So I think that this Noel Plum video... So I kind of... When I made this video, I kind of laid out a bait for it. And then I went into my critique. Really... it took me a little bit longer to make the video I wanted to make. The video I wanted to make was the fatal flaw of New Atheism. It's an animated video. I use animated lightly. It's just basically stick figures in the sort of PragerU style. that illustrates a lecture I gave called The Cult of Confidence, which directly attacks essentially the over-application of science to tackling questions that are dealt with in philosophy. And it was I think he did this before, so he's not going to know what I was really getting at, so it's sort of fair.
That even if I make the clip, I'm still effectively going to have to interpret something which I find is quite ambiguous in terms of what he wants a response to. So in some ways it makes it more quote miney for me to give you a 30-second chunk and then respond to it, because I will be selecting the chunk to fit in with my reading of his video. So what I propose is this. The video is 6 minutes and 33 seconds long, so I advise you, I invite you, good viewer, to go and listen to the original, right, and to decide for yourself what he's asking for and to get a flavour for it. It's a good video, it's worth listening to. But what I will do now is to try and give you a quick interpretation of what he wants, and then to sort of give my response. To give a kind of summary of how I see the video, what he's saying is that effectively atheists are running around crowing about the victory that they've scored on YouTube, and that the world's going to hell in a handcart, effectively, metaphorically speaking, of course, because we're talking about atheists now. And then, well, what have atheists got to say about all of this, and how is their atheism going to replace what it's looking to replace? The the religions, the big religions of this world, I suppose he's talking about.
Oh, so it might metaphorically be going to hell, but it very unmetaphorically may be going towards a mouse utopia. So that's something to consider.
Christianity, because he seems to be focusing on the West. And this is where some of the ambiguity kicked in, because I couldn't really be sure whether he was talking in kinds of meta-ethics or rather in terms of applied ethics. It sounded at first he was talking more from a sort of philosophical meta-ethical perspective, and then more in terms of kind of applied ethics and the real situation of the world as the video got on. So I'm going to try and address all of those things in the order in which he talked about them. Watch the video. If you find your interpretation of the video is different, then I apologise to that. At least you know what it is that I'm addressing. So I'm addressing something even if it's not what he was actually asking. So to tackle all these points in turn, then the first thing is this idea that atheists are crowing, that they've won. And what I can say to that is, because I've been on YouTube through all of this as I think as much a YouTube atheist as most people would define as YouTube atheists, especially in the early years up to 2012, 2008 to 2012 for me, when that's all that I talked about on YouTube, which was that we did win. But we didn't win through strength of argument, because that's not a win that can be achieved. Not with adults, not with people that have already developed their beliefs, and there's just too much at stake, I think, for adults in the main to change their position, as shown by the data in the British Social Attitude Survey, as I've shown several times, where cohorts keep their level of religiosity cohort on cohort. We have the data of that. The only victory that you can achieve is the military victory, really. I mean, the Catholic Church would be proud of what atheists have done on YouTube, really, because it's entirely in line with what Christianity and Islam has done, spreading the word of those proselytizing religions around the world. It's not going into different places and then using strength of philosophical argument to win. Some of that has taken place, but it's been through the sword. It's been the sword not just in terms of converting people, but in terms of maintaining orthodoxy, which is critical, isn't it, to the success of religion, keeping people in lockstep and clamping down on them when they come out of line.
I don't know. I mean, I guess I agree with this in some sense. I mean, you don't. Argument does not convince people. Preaching and teaching convinces people. Preaching involves narratives, examples. Essentially, it's sort of an extended teaching to adults. And teaching is the formation of younger minds into trained adult minds. And he's absolutely right in saying that we know that this sort of really rarefied dialectic doesn't work. I'm kind of surprised to hear him admit this. I mean, I think there's good evidence. I mean, Jonathan Haidt even went over the evidence we have against the Socratic idea that adults largely change their minds in this way. But I agree, it was a method of preaching and teaching, and in some sense, that kind of made the apologists that went up against Christopher Hitchens really, they were on a fool's errand. I haven't done a video about that, but perhaps I should.
And I think that's largely what atheists did on YouTube, not through threat that you're going to burn somebody at the stake for heterodox beliefs, but simply through weight of numbers and the bullying that effectively comes along with that. A Christian would make a video back in the day. If it got 500 views, 1,000 views, you could be sure that at least half of them were YouTube atheist viewers just looking to find something to criticize, because we just seem to have the strength of numbers on YouTube, perhaps because there's a lot of atheists in different places around the world where they are very much in the minority, and they need a place, perhaps it doesn't apply to me, but they need a place where they're not going to, where they can speak their mind, they can be themselves, and they're not going to be clamped down on, they're not going to be frowned on, they're not going to become social pariahs.
I've noticed there's a lot that YouTube is a place for the gathering of forces, gatherings of people who want to discuss ideas that are in many ways taboo. And I think atheists were sort of a perfect storm. They're a growing demographic in the West, at least. They aren't overall. For a brief period when in 2006, when YouTube really came on the scene, and even later as it grew, and they were looking for a place where they could consolidate some kind of group hegemony. And I think YouTube was the place. I think he's right about that. It's interesting to think about, right?
So I think that's kind of what went on here on YouTube. And I think in the real world, of course, again, in the real world, outside of YouTube, these kind of philosophical wins don't happen. The way that things change, because they're changing now in the United Kingdom and have been for several decades, it's a generational thing. It's each generation becoming less religious than the previous one. One of the statistics I've quoted many times recently is that despite the Church of England still being the official state religion of the United Kingdom, 18 to 21-year-olds, only 3% now regard themselves as Anglicans, associate with that within the United Kingdom. It's dying on its arse.
Amazing, after all those liberal reforms that church did. Oh, man. You think that, I just always imagine that the Anglican priests are just looking at their parish enrollment sheets and just wondering, oh, well, we did everything to get young people into the church and they're shunning us.
Quite frankly, it's dead. It just doesn't realise yet. It's like, I've been to people in car crashes before who they're still talking to you, but they're effectively, they've got a couple of hours to live. Their internal organs are beyond repair. They're dead. They just don't know about it. And that's kind of the state that the Church of England is in the United Kingdom, I propose, now. And that's kind of the way that it's going. So I think that's the situation. Is that anything to crow about? It isn't for me, in terms of YouTube and atheism, because I enjoyed the debate. And I didn't really want that kind of bullying victory. I'd have rather had no victory. I'd rather just kept the debate going in many ways, because there's always fresh people, there's always younger, impressionable people who go and listen to those debates and get to hear both sides, and it might impact upon them, and they might make a more informed choice while they're still young enough to make that choice. You're too old to make that choice, Distributist, and so am I. We're set in our ways now. There's nothing that I could say. There's nothing that I could say that's going to turn you into an atheist. There's nothing that you can say that I haven't heard before. There's nothing that you can say to me that's going to make me go, oh, do you know what? I think I'm going to become a Catholic. It's just not going to happen.
This is really interesting, actually. I thought this would be kind of a boring video, but it's certainly not. Wow. I guess, I mean, as someone who had sort of a late-in-life conversion to Catholicism, it's true. It's true that once you get out of your 20s, it's much harder to change your worldviews. It's happened. It's happened. I've known people who've had a change of heart in their 50s. It doesn't happen through debate, though. Intellectual arguments tend to be a young man's game. And I think, this is sort of an interesting thing. I think everyone's kind of figuring out to what extent do the dialectics, do a conversation between informed individuals. To what extent is that really sort of something where new ideas can come? That's fair. I think it's sort of limited to a certain extent. But it has several good effects. Even for people who aren't going to change their opinions, it's a very good intellectual exercise. It's more likely that that debate does not necessarily turn atheists into Christians and Christians into atheists, but it turns less intelligent atheists into more intelligent atheists. If I were to get into a debate with Godless Cranium, if he came on my channel and we had a live stream, I don't think I'd convince him to be Catholic, but I think that he would leave the live stream being less an atheist like P.Z. Myers and more an atheist like Leia Labresco was, or more an atheist like Anthony Flew was. Those are two bad examples because both of them actually were argued into either deism or Catholicism. But perhaps I could say more an atheist like Thomas Nagel was. Not a more intelligent atheist, someone who has a more nuanced view of things. And this is true of Christians too. There are a lot of middle brow intellects in Christianity, and it really, really pisses me off. I'm going to swear, I already said the F word for a fact because I want to make it impactful. So I might as well just unleash the profanity. But there's just a shitload of like middlebrow intellects in Christianity. You don't get pure flicks films from a culture that engages frequently with atheists. You don't. These bad cultural artifacts. By pure flicks, they made the movie God Isn't Dead and half a dozen other cringy Christian movies. And this culture comes from a perhaps devout, but nonetheless inarguably isolated Christian community that does not know its opponents well and does not know arguments well and does not understand that what keeps people out of Christianity is something more than just some cartoonishly belligerent atheist professor. So I welcome debates because debates might make more C.S. Lewis's and fewer not that Rick Warren is a bad person, or fewer Jerry Falwells. I'll go to that well again.
Is it? We went on to say then about the world going downhill. That this is really important now, you said, that this atheism, so the atheism takes over, it's replacing all religion. Let's say it's happening throughout society. And this is really critical now, because the world is going downhill. It sounded like almost like typical religious, eschatological sort of end times talk I was getting from you there. Now is the critical time. Now we've got all the signs of the fucking end times of the coming of Lord, And
I think he knows that I'm not like this. No, I didn't see a sign. I'm recognizing history, and if he wants to take it from an atheist, I'm not worried. I mean, I am worried about the Book of Revelation. I'm a Christian. But in a more immediate sense, I'm worried about the mass utopia. Just that. It's not even signs. You can see it manifest.
I just don't get that at all, actually. I don't think that today, now, this year is a particularly bad time. I don't know how old you are. I don't know if you're as old as I am. I'm 45. You look in your 30s or something like that?
Yeah, early 30s. I'm definitely not as old as he is.
Maybe I'm doing you a favour, a little bit older, I don't know. But when I grew up, the Cold War was still on, And they were pretty grim times. I remember the film, was it The Day After, and the series Threads. We're just getting to grips with the fact that this Cold War was still ongoing, and there didn't seem to be an end in sight, and that we're just starting to realise just how grim it would be if the old mutually assured destruction kicked in. Just what a grim, horrible scenario that would be. The world looked pretty grim then. It doesn't look anything like that grim to me now. So I don't know what it is that you're seeing.
I don't know. I honestly don't know. This is an age thing. I don't know this. How would it... It definitely isn't the 90s. It definitely isn't the 90s. That's clear. Where the 80s or the 70s... I can imagine the 70s. And this is perhaps... The 70s were, I think, a very depressing time. And the more and more I think about it, the millennium, the baby boomers were very much formed by the transition from the 70s to the 80s, where I am very much formed from the transition between the late 90s and, well, really everything that came after the late 90s. And the 70s, the 60s facilitated a big change in the culture, a very negative one. And sometime around 1979, and this carried out all throughout the 70s, and it manifested not only in sort of like a big cultural decline. America really lost its first war in the 70s. It developed a number. The crime rates skyrocketed in the 70s. The families took their big declines in the 70s. The racial issues really exploded in the 70s. Of course, this all came from the 60s, but it didn't really manifest until the 70s. And you had also the first explosions of some really bad serial killers in the 70s. And it seemed, along with domestic terrorism erupting, it really seemed that American society might be on its ropes. And if you look at the movies from that time, sure enough, they're very depressing. And then sometime around the 80s, it did really correspond to the Reagan years. We took a step away from the brink. And, there was a lot of criticism of Reagan, but not as much as Nixon, right? Not as much as Nixon. Even the really progressive people, they didn't like Reagan. They didn't like his policies. But America generally, and this wasn't really a political step back, regardless of what the neoconservatives tell you, it was not caused by Reagan. It was caused by a number of immune reactions to the Cultural Revolution that took place in the 70s. And because of these immune reactions, society took a step away from the progressive path that was introduced in 1968. And for a brief period between the 80s and the 90s, we sort of realigned ourselves to a more normalized America. Now, over that 20 years in the academia, the progressives very slowly destroyed that immune response in society. And it looks like starting in 2008 and the cultural change has indeed continued apace. And we find ourselves right now with what might be a re-upping of the crime rate, although it's too soon to say, and with a measurable decrease in racial harmony, which it is measured. We can actually see that now. And it might be that the cultural, this is a continuation of the cultural product. But I think that it's interesting because it probably is not as bad as it was in the 70s, but I do think that it's not just me. People are more pessimistic now. Now, I don't think pessimism is a good thing. I think that leaders need to overcome their pessimism, and this is a character flaw of mine. I recognize that. And I'm trying to overcome my own pessimism, but it's interesting to think about. I don't really have a response, but I'll keep on going.
Maybe some of the grimness that you're seeing relates to your religion, right? Because you have certain moral positions as a result of your religious conviction, and you see them slipping away. I don't know what your positions are on abortion, on homosexuality, on gay marriage, on women's rights, on all these kinds of things. But if they are traditional Christian positions, then I suppose you can see everything going to rack and ruin. But from my perspective, I don't see these as bad things. I don't see these things as endangering me or endangering the world in any way. I see these as social change that's generally for the better and that we're heading in the right direction.
I wonder if the decline of the family is seen in the same way. I mean, these are directly related phenomenon. They're part of the same cultural sexual revolution.
And even if they're not, I don't see them as particularly injurious things. They're not going to harm you. They're not going to have you turfed out of your house or your home blown up or your kids destitute on the street, starving or anything along those lines. So I just didn't get that. But they are important questions, and you ask the question in this kind of way that I found a little bit ambiguous, where at first it seemed to be heading in a kind of meta-ethical direction in terms of what are atheists going to replace it with? You know, we've had these arguments that God provides this kind of basis for objectivity, and if you get rid of God, then what's your basis for moral objectivism? And, you know, then it seemed to move on to something else. I mean, there's so many things that I could say with regard to this. The first would be, I suppose, that one claim that I know that most Christians that I've spoken to on this, they agree with me, that even if morals are objective, and they believe that they are, that they're not party to what those morals are, right? You don't know what is objectively morally right and morally wrong. You're only guessing, picking up hints, and that is why Christianity, after 2,000 years, is still refining and altering what it regards as moral and immoral.
Well, we're refining the details, but the core still remains more or less the same. The thing is, it actually does not take all that many moral presuppositions to get to the Christian sexual morality. If any of you like C.S. Lewis, he does, he basically argues for Christianity, and he argues about it in a really roundabout way, and it didn't, Mere Christianity didn't really help me all that much. I love the book, but, it's far from perfect. But in basically 2 or 3 pages, he's very able to succinctly put the Christian sexual morality and justify it in terms of natural law. It doesn't require a booming voice coming down from the heavens to saying premarital sex is wrong to determine that premarital sex is wrong. If you have some presuppositions about how you want families organized, about how you want men and women valuing each other, about how you want society generally behaving in terms of how it has men and women cooperating, you can get to these things. So, with the exception of these dying churches like the Church of England, which aren't, in my mind, even really preaching Christianity, they're just preaching modernity with the facade of Christ in the wings. It really hasn't changed all that much.
Because you're only getting shadows of this realm of objective moral facts, even if you claim that it exists. And of course, the other thing is moral conundrums typically they put in tension. They're a moral dilemma. They put in tension one moral fact against, or one moral problem against another, so that to deal with one, you're going to take away another. If you save this person's leg, this other person goes insane, or what have you. So how does that function? Which one rates above the other? And just having a sort of Ten Commandments style view of morality is neither use nor fucking ornament. That doesn't help you with moral dilemmas, because those situations tend not to be dilemmas. They tend to be too clear cut. It's not a case of thou shalt not kill. It's a case of, well, how about this? I've got to kill this person, or 50,000 people are going to die of this virus, or this is going to happen, or...
I don't think that, these trolley problems really are somehow easier for atheists than Catholics. I don't know if that's the point he's making, but... there are moral dilemmas there, but that's not... moral dilemmas like this aren't really what objective morality is postulated to solve. Their objective morality is postulated in order for us to be able to say something like, you shouldn't do this, and have it actually mean something that's not directly related to my own feelings. That's too big of a subject to get into here, but I have videos on this before. Read After Virtue. If people are really interested in this, my alternative channel, Traditionalist Codex, has the entire audiobook of After Virtue, which goes into this problem of objective morality from a really great thinker called Alistair McIntyre.
This person's going to lose a leg or lose an eye, and I've got to decide which one happens. These are moral dilemmas, and none of this helps us, so we're still in the same boat. And with regard to that, and with regard to Scripture, of course, one of the claims is that religion has Scripture. It has this basis, and if you get rid of this, what do we replace it with? What does the atheist replace it with. And of course, the obvious retort, it's not one you won't have heard before, but that doesn't mean that it's not worth reiterating, is that it doesn't seem to work that way in religion. It doesn't actually seem, I've got to be frank, it doesn't seem as if religious people get their morality from Scripture. It seems to me that religious people interpret Scripture on the basis of their morality.
Well, this is something, I mean, this is not a very solid thing. I mean, the Christian does not believe that the moral systems in the Bible, well, I don't know, I guess there could be schools of thought, but anthropologically, we just know that mankind did not learn that it's wrong to murder from the Bible. It's really more of an etymology of morals. It's, you knew it was wrong to kill people, and you knew this because God, right? Or it's justified because man is in the image of God. And so now you have an intellectual basis, or I should say perhaps a slightly more fleshed out intellectual basis, or a unifying principle for what you sort of knew in Piecemeal before. In some sense, religion is less like the observation that objects fall to earth. It's less like, it's less like, so to do an analogy, religion is a unifying principle. It's less like the observation that objects fall to earth than it is like the theory of gravity that tells you why objects fall to earth and presents some insight into how objects might behave in other circumstances we haven't seen before. And the same thing is true. It doesn't tell you that murder is wrong. Human beings have a natural instinct, and society, through the process of tradition, has a natural tendency to conform itself to being more less amenable to murder. But religion tells you, it gives you a different framework for interpreting this and talking about it.
Because the interpretation of Scripture seems to change all the time. It seems to blow with the wind as the winds of moral thinking, so it's got to be coming from somewhere else, hasn't it? It's got to be coming from somewhere else other than Scripture for you to be able to interpret Scripture and pick out those bits of Scripture you go, well, that bit sounds okay, so this bit we go by. That bit, don't like the sound of what's happening to the Midianites, or don't like some of that Leviticus stuff. We're going to get rid of. We're not going to concern ourselves with those bits. Obviously, they need to be interpreted in an allegorical way. But these other bits we'll take literally. Where does that ability to do that come from?
Okay, so both the premise and the logic of this particular statement is incorrect. As I said before, the premise that interpretation has changed massively. Okay, it's changed massively in 100 years, but it did not change massively in 2000, or in the history of Christianity. The interpretation of Christianity has been more or less consistent. You don't go back to the Middle Ages and find people using passages justifying the slaughter of the Midianites to justify the slaughter of their neighbors. You just don't. So if you were to go to someone like William Lane Craig, their interpretation will be slightly different, obviously, because of the Reformation, than the interpretation of someone like Aquinas or even earlier Augustine. But it wouldn't be massive. And you wouldn't have people in Augustine's time telling you that, oh, yeah, actually, kill the Midianites means kill anybody who disagrees with you. So that premise is wrong. The second logical thing that's wrong with this is just the fact that, we interpret nothing. Because we pick and choose our interpretations based on some prior thing. If that were true, if all we were doing was reading scriptures and applying sort of our superficial emotions to the scriptures, religious believers would essentially use scripture entirely as a mode of confirmation bias. This is just frankly sociologically not the case. Religious people do a number of things that they have no idea why they make sense. An example of this would be, for myself, would be birth control. So when I first came to Christianity, I was really against abortion. Now, I had moved on the abortion issue myself. Initially, I was conservative. I thought it was wrong. Then I became more progressive, and I thought it was okay. And then when I was heading back towards religion, I really thought it was bad again because it's murder and all of the arguments. And I saw actual pictures of the surgery. But when I came to Catholicism, finally, I really balked at their position on birth control because I'm like, what's the deal, right? And I even had a logical argument against it. And the logical argument was, okay, well, the church supports natural family planning, and all birth control does is statistically lower the probability of a pregnancy, and that's all. That's all what natural family planning does too. So the church has admitted that it's all right to lower the probability of a pregnancy. Therefore, how can birth control be wrong? And then I learned more about birth control, and I learned more about Catholic moral theory, and I read things like John Paul II's arguments, and I changed my opinion. I slowly saw the reason, but I accepted that birth control was wrong as part of becoming Catholic, even before I knew it was wrong. Just like I accept the power of prayer even before I see exactly what the benefits are. I guess that's a little bit worse because I do directly see the benefits of speaking to the divinity, but there are a number of ritualistic practices believers follow, and they do not know the reason for them. There's lots of moral limitations that believers accept without agreeing with them. So this can't just be confirmation bias. This can't. This has to be something that is something that's coming from without. So because of that, this doesn't really hold up. So both the logic and the premise are a little bit incorrect here.
And one of the things that I recall, it's not the only person I've heard say this, but I've heard William Lane Craig talk about this, is that what he's saying, as I understand it, is that from his perspective, morality is not, our sense of morality isn't rooted in scripture, it's innate. But it's innate and given by God, that this is the great fucking gift that God has given us, which is this sense of morality. He's given us this moral sense and an empathetic sense, which I suppose is tied to it, that allows us, and this is how William Lane Craig explains the fact that even atheists can be moral. He says this quite openly. Atheists can be very moral people too. But what is this based on? It's based upon this innate moral sense. And so, of course, atheists would have this regardless of whether or not they believe in God. So this wouldn't be a concern from your perspective because it doesn't require the religion. It doesn't require the scripture. It exists. Everybody in the world could be atheists. God exists still. You were right, after all. God exists. We're all atheists, but we've still got this innate sense. And I'm kind of happy with that because it isn't far from my position, because I believe that we still have that innate sense. I just don't think it's God-given. I think that we've evolved this moral sense as a way of controlling our social environment. Other apes have a moral sense. They have simpler social environments. They have simpler moral senses. We've got a much more complicated social environment. It's in our selfish interest to control that social environment, and our sense of morality and justice and right and wrong is our way of influencing the behaviour of others to make the behaviour of others more amenable to ourselves. It's better behaviour that's more in our interest than the genes that code for that behaviour. So effectively, I've got the evolutionary version of what William Lane Craig attributes to God.
It's just called natural law, and I agree there's something here, but I'll let him go a little bit further.
Either way, we seem to have this thing, and that exists whether we believe in God or not. And so eventually in your video, you seem to be going down the line of how is this all going to pan out? You know, we're going from sort of meta ethics, and we're veering into applied ethics, and sort of how is this going to work out? I can only say it's already working out like that. Okay. In the United Kingdom, again, another statistic I've quoted numerous times recently for one reason or another, only 32% of people in the United Kingdom now say that they, when asked, say that they believe in God. Only 55% of those who identify as Christians in the United Kingdom now say they believe in God. And yet we still miraculously seem to be able to have moral discussions, because most of the political discussions we have, in one sense or another, are moral discussions. And whether or not, the funny thing is that even if we can ground our meta-ethics in something, and in terms of objectivity, I've never been satisfied that the religious that the God believers can do it any more than the atheists, because to me the existence of an omniscient, omnipotent deity in no way objectifies the moral commands that he or she issues. It doesn't work for me, that. So,
well, I mean, they make the moral commands and the moral inclination something that exists in a metaphysical sense in the creator. And as such, that it exists as an object that we can point to and argue if it's this way or that. If the ethical systems we're following are just emotions that appear in our minds, I don't know how you can have an argument over them. I mean, you can have an argument, like you can literally have, but there's sort of a cognitive dissonance that goes along, and I'm not so sure it really is it's dealt with. And I'll finish this out.
It never works for me, under any circumstances anyway. But aside from all of that, we can still have these moral discussions, this applied morality, this applied ethics, this business that we take part in on a day-to-day basis. And in fact, most of the time, let's be honest, for the average person, not you or I that are holding these discussions, because you're not a typical theist, you're not a typical Christian, I'm not a typical atheist. If we were, we wouldn't be doing this online. For most of them, they're quite happy. They might discuss this in school, and I know this because my wife teaches morality and ethics in school, or has done in the past, is that these things will be discussed. What is our morality based on? But beyond that, a lot of people will go through life never really thinking about that again. The only realm of ethics that they will deal in will be applied ethics. We'll be talking about actual moral situations that have some traction in real life. What is the right thing for us to do? What is the wrong thing for us to do? Is it okay? Is abortion okay? How many weeks down the line should we allow it? What circumstances should we allow it in? They don't start saying, oh fucking hell, but is there a basis for my meta-ethics here? Do I need some objectivity? If everything is subjective, then what am I to say if Adolf Hitler comes in front of me? Blah, 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 blah. Right? They never go down those lines. So if your concern is that society isn't going to function unless we can find some philosophical, I think this is a Sam Harris term, philosophical bedrock for morality, I don't think it's going to make the damnedest bit of difference. That only matters to philosophers. Everybody else is just going to get on with it. Right?
Yeah, but you see, the philosophers do control more than they see. And so there's two things. First of all, the concession that people don't really have these really, really rarefied and pure engagements with dialectic, and that kind of destroys at a very base level the sort of King Crocoduck idea. Well, I don't know if it's really his idea, but my strawman version of King Crocoduck's idea of the dialectic of democracy. Most people get their ideas handed down to them from intellectuals. Now, several problems. The first problem is that there is sort of a pleb tier version of divine command theory, and that is that we know that people behave more morally the more they are aware of being watched, or the more they feel like they're in the presence of a moral authority. And to that extent, people who participate and practice religions, not people who claim to practice religion, but people who actually practice their religion and are more aware of a deity being present in their lives, tend to act in much more moral ways. They give more to charity, they participate more when they're in their community, and we do know when they're around religious objects, they act more honestly. And even if they've just recently prayed, they act more honestly. So there's a lot of evidence that there is an effect that exists non-intellectually that we can associate with religious practice, if not purely religious belief. And the other thing, I hate to pound this one again, but I guess we're just going to have to agree about what a betrayal the last 40 years of intellectual life is. Because, in my opinion, a lot of the malfeasance that's occurred in family formation, in the decline of the family, and the decline of people cooperating together, in the emergence of these strange grooming gangs you have in England, these have been directly the result of intellectual mistakes made by philosophers in the academy. And their mistakes, a large point, extend from the departure of their ethical system from the bedrock of Christianity.
Right, they're just going to carry on doing it in just the same way as when you tell me you find pasta really, really tasty. You absolutely love pasta. You're not racked with doubt over whether there's there must be some objectivity to the experience of taste and smell. Otherwise, what am I doing announcing this, right? It just...
Yeah, but again, why did he use this example? Because this is the very example I used to answer it. This is like the mouse Utopia. I mean, he's tossing me into the briar patch here. Yeah, we don't have existential doubt about whether we like pasta. We also don't have laws about whether we like pasta. Society doesn't depend on whether we like pasta. And most importantly of all, we don't have dialectic discussions about whether pasta is good or not. So if you want to have a conversation about whether pasta is good or not, you're going to have an idea over whether pasta can be good.
It doesn't even enter in to your thinking, does it? We can still have those discussions regardless of how objective or subjective our sense of taste and smell is, regardless of whether they're grounded in something evolutionary in terms of the purposes that they serve, in terms of stopping us eating food that's dangerous to us, in terms of helping us pick out calorific rich foods that are good for us. None of that needs to enter into our thinking.
So the question of whether something is good or not is very different from the question of whether I evolved an instinct to think that this is good. I wanted to steal a sum of money from my friend, let's say. I can argue over whether it's right to steal the money or whether it's permissible. Maybe he was an asshole to me. Maybe there's an exception I can think of, right? Maybe I can justify it to myself. That can be a question I ask. I can't ask whether I have evolved the instinct to do it or not. Because likely what I'm doing is I'm seeing the money and I have a dilemma. Either yes or no. And one instinct is telling me yes and one instinct is telling me no. And guess what? Both instincts evolved. So the question of whether it evolved is doesn't even answer the question one way or the other. The existence of the dilemma makes the question over whether it evolved to begin with moot.
So I'm not even sure what your concern is there. Well, listen, I hope you've watched this video, Distributist. I hope you found it interesting. Maybe if this doesn't answer your concerns, maybe it will at least clarify the misunderstanding that's taking place with regard to this. Okay.
So I'm just going to end the video there. Yeah, I mean, it was sort of unfair. I really put this video response off. Noel Plum videos, I always find them really, really hard to answer, so I tend to put them off. But this it wasn't really fair because Noel Plum was not responding to the mainstay of my arguments, and in many ways I answered this video as an extension of another argument that I was making against liberals, and he's sort of sitting here in the past without the benefit of seeing those other conversations, and the fact that I got to him last is not very fair, but. That was, I answered them in order of length just to make sure that I wouldn't get tired. And sure enough, I think that was a good strategy because I got all the way through. So this time I'm not going to take questions. I'm just going to post the link to the Discord. I may be on briefly to talk to people who want to come. So I'll just post it in the chat here. And I hope to see you. Around perhaps, and have a wonderful night, and have a wonderful 2018.